Welcome back to the podcast. This time, there's been a long break. I've had technical issues, a dead computer, and getting another one sorted. So excited to be back and chatting this time with Chris Brett, who is former Met Police from a very long time ago. And I'm not going to say too much about it because we're going to talk through everything that he's going to want to say as we get through this. So the reason I asked Chris if he'd be open for a chat is because resilience has very much been a huge part of his particularly working life for a very long time, and it really fits his story, fits with the kind of the theme and the ethos of the podcast. So yeah, Chris, welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Simon. Nice to see you again. Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. As I say, I've been invited by a few people over the past year or so, but this is the first one that's actually materialized. So thanks very much. Much appreciated.
Pleasure. Their loss.
Good to be here. I was trying to think, the first time I met you, I think, was many moons ago on a job that was organised by a mutual friend of ours. And I seem to remember turning up as an observer.
That's right, yeah. Yes.
Yes.
The Mandarin.
The Mandarin. I think it was the Browns Hotel actually that I first encountered.
Browns. Okay. Yes.
The fleeting conversation outside the front there. A certain gentleman that our friend was taking care of, but that
was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. Yeah, as you say. So yeah, I mean, in relation to the police, I spent a large part of my working life in the police. Concurrently to that, been an active participant in combat sports, both as a practitioner and as a trainer, instructor, and as well as that, obviously involved in the private security industry. So in relation to yourself, obviously being a psychologist, I've followed your stuff over the last few years. And I think obviously you're primarily from a military background, but when you look at what's going on with the military and the emergency services in general, they're facing common problems, really, common challenges. I think that's isn't it? So in relation to my own journey, I suppose it's always good to go back to the very, very beginning, which is, in my case, quite a long time ago. Being a psychologist, you'll appreciate we have to go back to the depths of childhood trauma, I think. So I think that's where we'll go. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1960s, Simon, as a small child. So obviously the world then was a very, very different place to what it is today.
Oh God, yeah. It's chalk and cheese, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're a little bit younger than me, but even so.
A little bit.
But the world was a very different place. I grew up in southeast London. My mother is Maltese. That's one of the reasons I'm actually in Malta today, I suppose, but not the main driver. My father was a Londoner, very much a Londoner. He was from South London, and he worked for Whitbread's, the brewery.
Yes.
So they were different people in many ways. Obviously, my mum was very Maltese, an island woman, really. Came to Malta came from Malta to England in the 1950s, and my dad was South London, born and bred. So we all lived in a little house in southeast London, and it was myself, my little brother, my mum and dad. So my introduction to the effects of crime in about 1967, which was when I was a very, very small child. My mother took myself and my little brother out shopping one day, and she had one of those old 1960s prams, not these nice buggies that they have these days, but the big old metal prams.
Yeah.
And even before, it was really before supermarkets, we still used to walk down to the local shops, and we went shopping one day. My brother was in the pram. My mother was obviously pushing it, and I'm walking along beside. We did our bits and pieces, went shopping. Then we got back home, which is only about a 10-minute walk away, entered the house. There's a little house. It was actually semi-detached, which makes it sound a bit posh, but it wasn't. It was just happened to be the one on the end. Got inside the house, walked through to the dining area and the kitchen area, and we noticed that the kitchen door, which is an old wooden door with small glass windows, one of the small glass windows was broken, and there was blood on it. So, and I, as a 5-year-old, I sort of figured that there was something not quite right here. This is a bit strange. And my mother thought it was an animal or a bird, or some bird or animal had sort of either flown into it or disturbed or hit the window or something. So anyway, while we were talking about it, we heard a sort of noise behind us, and there's a sort of shuffling. And I remember turning round, and we saw this figure standing in the dining room. And all I could remember was the fact that he had a mask over his face, which later transpires, we think it was some sort of handkerchief. And in his hand, he had this brass poker that was from our fireplace. Now, I didn't realize at the time, but many, many years later, when I did get involved in officer safety training in the police, I was told, or came to learn, that one of the effects of stress was that if you're confronted with somebody with a weapon, the first thing that happens is you have tunnel vision, and you focus on that weapon that they've got in their hand, and it seems a lot bigger than it actually is. And
Yeah.
I can assure you, as a 5-year-old, this poker looked enormous. And one of the other effects is what they call auditory exclusion, where you go a bit deaf and you don't hear anything. So my mother assures me that this time she was rambling to this character, basically pleading for him not to hurt us, because my brother was about 18 months. And by this time she'd had him in her arms. And I can remember we were basically ordered to go up the stairs of our house. So it was myself, my mother. We got up to the top. This character snatched my baby brother from my mum's arms and threw him on the bed. And then he forced us to sit down on the floor, and we were tied up against well, it must have been a bed, I suppose, but we were tied up, myself and my mother. Now, thinking back on it now, when you actually analyze it, and as I have done over the years, you realize just what a dangerous situation that was, and what could have happened. I mean, it could have gone very, very, very wrong. And I don't know what my mum said to him, but ultimately he didn't actually harm us. He left the room, basically burgled the house, ransacked it, and left. And of course, we didn't actually know what had happened, but we were left tied up in this bedroom. And after about 20 minutes, we couldn't hear any noise anymore. So we thought between us that he'd obviously gone. So my mum and I managed to untie ourselves, and it transpired that he had left. We went downstairs. My mum shouted and screamed in the driveway, and the neighbour called the police, because in those days, of course, there was no mobile phones.
Yeah.
One of those things you had in the room if you're lucky, a bit of cord and a thing you put to her ear. So the neighbour called the police, and they turned up, and that was my first encounter really with the police. And again, we're talking about the 1960s, so 1996, 1966, 1967. So at that time, you had the Krays and the Richardsons were still out and about. It was old.
Yeah.
It was very much old London. And I always remember the CID, as they were, turned up, and they had the long Macs, and they were all the sort of short hair with the moustaches. And I always remember how sort of kind they were to us. That stuck with me. How good they were with myself, my mum, and my brother. And of course, my dad came home because they informed him. He was obviously in a bit of a panic, and it stuck with me how professional they were and how good they were and how they looked after us. I mean, albeit the burglar wasn't nicked, but having said that, they really sort of performed well. So I suppose that was my first real experience of the effects of crime, as a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And
It's an early start.
we talk about things that happen in your childhood and trauma and all the rest of it, but I mean that certainly stayed with me. And I don't know whether that was something subliminal that later on led me to want to sort of lean towards the police. I mean, other things happened later that I'll talk about, but that was the first real incident that I was aware of crime and law and order and the police, really.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly an early start, an early introduction, isn't it? Not a nice thing to happen at any age.
No, indeed. So anyway, I mean, after that, I just, got older in South East London, went to school. It was an interesting place because by the time I got to secondary school, it was the the 1970s. It was the early 1970s. And the school I went to had just become a comprehensive. It had previously been, I think it was a grammar school, but anyway, it merged into a comprehensive. So we had people from all sort of levels of society, for want of a better expression. But we had, you know, the boffins at the top, and we had the not so clever people at the bottom, and everyone else in between. But it
Yeah.
was a real mixture. And I think, again, going to that school, there's about 1,500 kids. I sort of learned to sort of deal with people, you know, from different sort of parts of the world and different sort of, you know, different sort of areas. And you know, that was a good education. But from Bexley School, we had a few notable people there. I mean, former famous pupils, I suppose. There was Malcolm Allison, who was the England football manager, flamboyant England football manager. And I suppose
Yeah.
one of the most infamous previous pupils was Kenneth Noy, the criminal.
Yeah.
So rather sort of you know, well-known criminal now, isn't he? You know, in the criminal hierarchy, probably up there at the top. So he was a previous pupil. While I was there, I suppose it was the best known one was Andy Townsend, who was a footballer. He went on to play for the Republic of Ireland. There was a lot of interesting characters there. I mean, again, at that time, you know, in the 70s, I mean, you went to school, there was a bit of rough and tumble. You would get into fights, you know. It's not about being a troublemaker or minding your own business. It didn't matter who you were, you'd get into fights in the 1970s. It wasn't as
Yeah.
bad as it was now with all the stabbings. I mean, there were stabbings in Southeast London in the 70s, but certainly nothing like the number of stabbings you get now. Mainly in those days, it was old-fashioned sort of fist fights, really. And
Yeah.
that used to happen on a regular basis. So quite early on, I got into the idea of wanting to be able to defend myself, as every sort of kid does. And we were lucky because at Bexley Youth School, we had a teacher there called Mr. White. He was a judoka. He used to teach judo. And in the lunch hour, we used to go and do judo classes. So a couple of times a week, we'd do judo. So that was my sort of introduction to combat sports or martial arts, and did that for a couple of years. And then I got into, well, I wanted to get into karate before, but my dad wasn't too keen. He didn't like it. You know, he thought the only thing to do was boxing or nothing, basically. You know, so that was his
Yeah.
out. But at that time, it was the 1970s, and everybody wanted to be Bruce Lee. You know, so karate was the thing. Everyone
Yeah.
was into kung fu. You know, so again, at that time, a couple of the kids went to the local karate club, and again, back in the 70s, at this time, there was a lot going on between the National Front and the Anti-Nazi League and the British movements. You did have these sort of demonstrations and pitched battles on a regular basis between the National Front and the Anti-Nazi League. So
Okay.
one of the prominent people in the British movement was a guy called Nicky Crane, who was basically a skinhead. And you can actually Google this guy; he's quite interesting. And he was the head of the British movement, which is essentially a racist party. But he was of Italian descent, and he had about 6 brothers. And one of them he had a younger brother called Gino, who was a nice guy. And he went to this local karate club, and he was one of the people that I spoke to about doing karate. So that's basically what led me to go to start karate, and that was Thames Karate under Ray Fuller and Pauline Fuller. So again, Ray Fuller was an interesting character. He was an ex-soldier. He served in the Suez sort of saga back
Yeah.
in the 50s. And his wife Pauline was a northerner, and she was the first female to get a black belt in karate, I think in 1967 in England. But again, this was in the days when when a black belt actually means something. Unfortunately, over the years, especially into the sort of 80s, a lot of sort of fake martial arts came along. People were sort of inventing their own systems and all this. And that went on really until, I suppose, YouTube and social media started, because then, of course, they started to get exposed. But anyway, in those days, I was lucky enough that they were teaching nearby, so I started karate with them. So I was doing my judo, doing my karate. You know, the people that had picked on me before came unstuck because, you know, I'd have a pop back, and we just sort of carried on through school. No real thoughts about what I wanted to do for a job or career. I was pretty bright at school, but like a lot of kids, I got bored with it. So I suppose I peaked academically at about 14, But of course, that's 2 years before you do your O levels, as it was back then. So I
Yeah.
sort of lost interest. So consequently, probably I didn't get as many O levels as I should have done. But hey ho, that's life. But then during the sort of last year of school, something happened that did strike a sort of nerve. There was a couple of kids there at school. One was called Gary, and one was called Dave. Now, this guy Gary, he was a bit of an hooligan. He was a bit of a proper yob, and he was always getting into all sorts of bother. Anyway, one day we found out he was going to join the army, right? So he was going to join the Junior Leaders Regiment, as it was back then.
Yeah.
So he went off and did that. And there was another kid he wasn't a yob, he was a bit quiet actually, but he was going to join something called the Metropolitan Police Cadet Corps, as it was then. So, okay, they went off and did that. Didn't think any more of it. So about 6 months later, this Gary turned up at school and in full combats, came into school to come back to tell everybody at school what the army was like. And he was full of it, and you could see he was he certainly didn't appear to be a yob anymore. He was very conscious of his appearance, and he was excited about how he was progressing in the army, and that
Okay.
sort of struck a chord with me, because when you looked at what he was like to what he'd become, the transition was fairly swift. And then this Dave came back, having done, I think it was the 16-week course in the Cadet Corps. And again, he seemed a lot more confident. He was full of all the tales of the cadets and what a police career could lead to. So that was the first time I really stood up and took notice of any sort of possibility of, getting into some sort of disciplined services career, I suppose. So I spoke about it with my dad and my mum didn't want me to join the army. And my dad wasn't too keen on any of it because he did his national service. And as far as he's concerned, it just got in the way of him doing his job. But obviously, that's a different kettle of fish, national service. But
Yeah.
anyway, and as for the police, well, he wasn't anti, but he sort of respected them, but he wasn't particularly too keen on me being one of them, So that was the scenario. So, so anyway, this was 79. So I decided I'd give it a go with the police. I thought I'm going to give this a go. I fancy it. So it was in November 1979 that I actually applied to join the police cadet corps, as it was then. Now, in those days, I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. But in those days, it was not dissimilar. The structure wasn't dissimilar, as I understand it, to what they did with the junior leaders. It was a sort of, it was a bit like a sort of boarding school, really, where you got your uniforms. You have to get up early in the morning,
Yeah.
polish your boots, have your bed packs, be on parade, do your PT, do your classwork, and it was a bit of a shock to the system had you not been used to that. So that's what I entered into. And in those days, there were two courses. There was the A course, what they called the A course, which was 2 years in total, or there was the B course. Now, the A course, to do the A course, you had to be 16, and then it took you up to 18 or 18 and a half when you joined the adult police. I was
Okay.
at this time, I was 17, so I was too old to do the A course. So I had to do the B course. So the B course basically meant that you had to cram in as much work as the A course did in half the time. So arguably it was a bit tougher. I mean, I don't know. I didn't do the A course, but essentially I know what I did, and it was quite compact. And the
Yeah.
way it worked was you do 16 weeks. That was what was then Hendon. Of course, it's all closed now.
Hmm.
Cuts and everything doesn't exist anymore. You did 16 weeks at Hendon in the Cadet Corps, and again, you got up every morning. The buzzer went. You had to have your feet on the floor. You're in a dormitory of 8 blokes. Make sure you had your uniform, you had your dress uniform, your AT uniform. You had to make sure it was all smart. And it was quite, it's a disciplined environment. And the whole idea was for them to look at you to see if you had what it took to be, a police officer in their eyes. And after the 16 weeks, you did what they call third phase training, where you went to a centre which was not at Hendon. You lived at the centre, and it was a bit more relaxed insofar as you had your own room. It wasn't an 8-man dormitory, and you went to work. So they'd attach you to a police station. So in my case, it was Vine Street Police Station, which was, again, it's not there anymore. It's shut, as have most of the police stations. But Vine Street Police Station was just behind Piccadilly Circus.
Hmm.
So back in 1980, a lot of the issues you had there were they still had the heroin addicts down in subway number 4. You had the Rent Boys on the meat rack, which was around the back of what was then Swan and Edgar, which then became Tower Records. A lot of Vice type stuff. So I remember turning up there. I was 18 because you still had to go out with a police officer. Obviously, as a cadet, you couldn't go out on your own, so you just walked along on the beat with a police officer. And I can remember 18 years of age turning up at Vine Street Police Station, and it was a night duty, and we were walking down Brewer Street in Soho, and the bright lights were there. The Raymond Review Club was there. The ladies of the night were there. Everyone was there, and it was like, I'd never seen anything like it, really. It was a sort of baptism of fire. And obviously, I mean, there's a few incidents I mentioned in the book, but I mean, Subway number 4 was a big one with the heroin addicts, insofar as you go down there and they'll be sort of shooting up in the sort of cubicles and all this sort of thing. And then I say the Rent Boys hanging around the meat rack that were then picked up by people and taken to nearby hotels or other places. So it was quite a sordid environment. And I remember a couple of incidents where we found a guy just collapsed in the cubicle with the needle hanging out of his arm, and literally having to drag him out up the stairs and call in the ambulance. And these things happen most nights. So that was a bit of an introduction to the vice of Soho. The other thing, of course, was I'm half Maltese. Now, back in those days, there was no diversity or inclusivity.
Yeah.
And if your mum had a dodgy accent, you didn't tell anybody, because it's not something you go off. So you didn't tell anybody you was half Maltese. You told them you was proper South London. But of course, who ran the prostitution up until the early 80s? It was obviously the Maltese. And they were still quite prominent in Soho, some of the back streets of Soho, Berwick Street, and all around there. And you still had the brothels that were run by the Maltese. And I'll come on to that a bit later about the Maltese mob. But essentially, so you had all that going on. So as I say, I did 6 months there, and eventually that took me up to adult training school, which is what I did in 1981 was when I first went up to Hendon. But again, that's all gone now. They don't do that anymore. That again was another 16 months of intensive training, different to the cadets insofar as obviously it was about being a police officer, and by this time they expected you to be sort of up to it, So, and you were then working or in training school with all sorts of people from different walks of life. In the cadets, you're with a bunch of 16, 17-year-olds. Suddenly you go to adult training school, you're with adults, you're with people that have actually been out in the world. And it really makes a difference. I mean, when I look back on it now, I think, personally speaking, to be an effective cop, you should be about 25 plus, really, because you need to have seen a bit of life, especially when you're dealing with like domestic type incidents, because you're 19 and you turn up to a domestic dispute between, someone and his missus, and you're trying to sort that out. I mean, you do your best, but obviously,
it's a tough ask.
The empathy might there, but the life skills probably aren't, So that's a bit of an issue. Having said that, I can only speak for myself. I mean, other people seem to manage and they got on with it. That sort of thing I found tough. But just going back to the training again, with the cadet training and the adult Hendon training. Again, back in the cadets, we had a couple of the PTIs. 2 of them were ex-Royal Marines, and there was I changed their names in the book, but anyway, I called him Bobby in the book. But he was an ex Commonwealth boxing champion, and he had the little moustache. They all wore the vests with the cross swords. And there's another one,
White shorts.
Yeah, and that's it. You have to iron the shorts and all that. So there was these 2 that they were the main PTIs, and one of them was doing the boxing, and the other one was doing the wrestling. And again, I was into everything, any combat sport, martial art. I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to get in there and roll around and fight and do whatever. So one day, it's quite funny. I'd done judo, and as you know, I'd done karate, but I hadn't done amateur wrestling, and I hadn't really done boxing at that point. So this Dan, I called him in the book, he had a wrestling class. So I remember going along there one lunchtime, and I walked in there, and they've all got the wrestling kit on. They're doing wrestlers' bridges, and they're lithe, you know, look quite handy. So he says to me, "You done wrestling before?" I said, yeah. Okay. So he's paired me up with this guy. Anyway, for 45 minutes, I was thrown around the gym and I was pinned to the ground. I was choked out, you know, and absolutely battered, you know. And I couldn't really answer it. I'd done judo, but that was totally different. So at the end of it, I'm sitting there all battered and bruised. And this Dan came along and he looked over, he looked down at me and he looked at the guy that I'd with and he said to him, "He's done wrestling before, you know." Of course. Yeah. So he sat me down and he said, "Okay," he said, "What's your name?" So I told him. So he said, "Well, what have you done then?" And I said, "Well, I've done judo and I've done karate." And he said, "Well, what grade then?" I said, "Well, orange belt in judo, brown belt karate." He said, "Okay." He says, "Well," he says, "Well, I quite like you. You may come back to my wrestling class." So that was the introduction to
Very
amateur.
nice of him.
But then this other guy, Bobby, the boxing instructor, he was a different animal, and he had those sort of I mean, he's obviously this we're talking about 1980s, so he would have been in Northern Ireland, I suppose,
Yeah.
the 70s era. But he had that look about him that you thought, nah, I don't want to mess with you, mate. You know, he had these like shark's eyes. He looked at you and nah, don't want to play with you. And we went on this boxing weekend, one of this boxing weekend in a place called Lippett's Hill, which is in Essex, right in the middle of Epping Forest. And in those days, it was the headquarters of, well, before it was SO19, it was D11 or PT17, D11. I think in those days it was D11. And it was their headquarters, and it subsequently became the helicopter base. But anyway, it's an
Okay.
old POW centre. So you've got the old Nissan huts there. And
Yes.
the cadets used to go there. We used to do like the adventure training in Epping Forest. And we did this boxing weekend one weekend. And we were paired up, you know, moving around, doing a bit of sparring and that. And again, I was okay, and I got long arms. I could throw the jab out, keep somebody at bay. If somebody really knew what they're doing on the inside, they'd really mess me up. But at that time, we were just sort of kids, you know. And I was throwing my jab out, keeping this kid at bay. And this Bobby came around and he sort of stopped, separated us, and looked at the other guy. He says, "You can hit him back, you know." He said, and it sort of went on like that. And then he's grabbed hold of me. He said, "Right, what cadet centre are you going to go to, you know, for third phase training?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "You go into Limehouse," he said, which was, of course, the boxing centre, which is where he was situated. But
Okay.
I thought, yeah, we'd heard a few stories about what had gone on there, and then luckily, I actually said that I got sent to Norwood, which is a bit more of the athletics place, more of a runner's place. Although I wanted to do boxing, I didn't quite fancy being there. But anyway, it just gives you an idea as to the sort of environment it was. I mean, it was they're just days long gone. It just doesn't, you know, it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, people join the police now. I think they got this college of policing. They sort of turn up and go to college. I don't even think there's a residential course anymore. They just turn up, do their sort of day at college, do a few exams, and take it from there. I mean, it's totally different to what it used to be. You know.
I think like many things, it's been watered down to the basic form, isn't it? So it's minimum standard. And the minimum standard is lower than it used to be as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we start to sound like old codgers, don't we? But I mean, I think
Yeah.
every generation sort of, you know, their you know, fathers or grandfathers or grandparents would always say, "Oh, you know, the youngsters of today, they've got it easy and all the rest of it." But I mean, I wouldn't say people today have got it easy. In many ways, it's very hard to actually sort of progress out there now. But if you're talking about certainly the training in relation to the police is what we're talking about. I mean, it's changed beyond recognition, and I'm not quite sure that I'm not quite sure that it would ever return to anything like that. I can't see how it can because there's no investment. They sold off all the buildings, all the training centres. I don't think there's the will really to go back to anything like that. You know, I mean the military is different, but again, they're suffering massive cuts, aren't they? I mean,
They
in
are, yeah.
areas.
The one thing that I don't know how you feel about this or your take on it is, when you see these videos on social media of the police dealing with bloody difficult situations,
Mm.
but they don't look like they've been prepared to be able to deal with these situations in a way that keeps them as safe as possible while
Yeah,
doing their job and protecting the public.
yeah.
They look like their hands are tied, and they're going to get more of a hiding than they should do.
I agree, but of course, we're treading on dangerous territory. I mean, you know, one of the things I've always said, I mean, we used to do boxing in the police. I mean, and it wasn't like milling in the army. I know people talk about milling. It wasn't milling. It wasn't going all out. It was just standing there and doing a round, exchanging a few blows so that the trainers, the PCIs could see, yeah, you'd stand your ground. You could take a shot and you could throw a shot. You weren't trying to kill each other. But
Yes.
they got rid of that. And from the early 80s to the 90s, they got rid of that. Then they switched to just hitting pads, like focus pads. All right, that shows you can throw a punch to a degree, but I mean, it doesn't really test much else. And then
No.
they got rid of it completely. Now, I don't know. I mean, I can only speak for myself because as far as, you know, I mean, the book that we, you know, actually covers a period of time from
This
1980.
one here.
That one there, it covers a period of time. Yeah, plug. It covers a period of time from 1980 to 1997. Now, those times, you know, they were very volatile. Now, okay, there's a lot going on today, but my attitude is that the training that we had, and not just the training we had in the police, but the training I decided to enter into of my own volition, you know, combat sports, martial
Yeah, yeah.
arts. I later became an officer safety instructor. I mean, I felt overall, personally, I was prepared. But the thing is, when you look at what goes on today, you know, well, you can't have boxing, you know, risk assessment this, risk assessment that. Well, in my opinion, every police officer needs to know what it's like to get a punch in the face, you know, and if you
Yeah.
don't, what's going to happen when you do get there? You know, if you've never, and even if you are trained and you get in real life, it's very different to training in a gym or training in a dojo or training in a controlled environment. I mean, with officer safety training, you know, over the years, we've tried to replicate as much as we can reality, but you can never really do that because it's always going to be a controlled environment. You
That's
know,
true.
whether you're doing tactical, whether you're doing bog standard officer safety training with empty hand techniques, or even when you come on later to do firearms training, whether you're doing a tactical refresher in the police, or whether you're doing like an exercise in the military, it's still controlled, isn't it?
Yes.
Ultimately,
Yeah, yeah.
you know in the back of your mind that really you shouldn't be getting killed or seriously injured. Or if you do, something serious has gone wrong. Accidents can always happen. So it's always a
Sure.
controlled environment. All you can do is push the boundaries as far as you can to get it as close to real life as possible. And that's what I would question. The disparity you seem to have. I mean, I've been out of the police 9 years now, so I've got to be a little bit careful because obviously it's a mercurial thing. But what I found was the training between well, certainly the day-to-day training that non-AFOs did, you know, authorized firearms officers, was obviously far less than the training that AFOs did. Because even as an AFO, as an authorized firearms officer, you got your tactical refresher, there's officer safety geared towards that, and
Yeah.
you were pushed more, and there was more stress put on you, obviously because you're carrying a firearm. But you know, in a way, you know, whether you're carrying a firearm or a taser or a baton or whatever you're carrying, you know, the stress as a police officer on the street is very high. And certainly you could argue that as a divisional police officer, whether they call it, you know, on a response team or whether you're on the beat or whatever you want, a uniformed police officer walking the streets or answering the calls, I would still maintain is the hardest job in the police. You know,
Yeah.
you can go into specialist units, but when you do that, a lot of the normal stuff, if you like, for want of a better phrase, you don't do. You focus on your particular specialism. But to be a divisional police officer, you know, patrolling the beat, you know, either on foot or in a vehicle on a daily basis is tough. It's always been tough, and it always
Yes.
will be tough. And what you've had over now many years is these cutbacks, which means, you know, there's less of them. There's a lot less of them, and they're a lot, arguably in many areas, probably a lot less trained. You know, so
I, I think
it's
so.
almost a perfect storm, isn't it? I don't know what the answer is really. I've thought about it long and hard, but it's every day in the newspapers you see these articles about another horror story, you know, and this, that, and the other. And
Yeah.
I know that there are some really good people in there. There are some really good people in there doing some good work,
Always has and always will be, you know?
but it's like they're really up against it. And you know, I feel sorry for them, really. I've got sympathy for anyone who's trying to do that job, who's really got their heart in the right place and
Yeah.
trying to make it work. It must be very, very difficult. I mean, one thing, I suppose, one thing that I sort of escaped, it was just coming in when I left, was this business about having a camera phone stuck in your face. I mean, the idea of actually, you know, you see these ones on YouTube now, what do they call them? Auditors or something. And they're just going out there to try and wind up the police, you know. I mean, and some of the comments you see are unbelievable, you know. It's, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, you know, if you're trying to deal with a difficult situation, and all someone's doing is sticking a camera in your face, I mean, I challenge anyone not to get a bit, a bit irritated by that.
Yep,
Yeah.
I know. And as always in these services, you have to be perfect in the eye of the law and the public.
Yeah. I mean, the knife crime is the prime sort of problem at the moment. And
Yep.
I did a video about this. I mean, this thing about stop and search is a classic one. And it's been going on for 40 years. I can go back to the early 1980s. Obviously, we had the Brixton riots in 1981. There's been all
Yep.
sorts of issues over the years. A lot of it is about, communities, you know, basically reacting to being stopped and searched. Well, I did a very simple video a little while ago, and I mean, there's stabbings in London now. I mean, I don't know if it's daily, but certainly it seems to be every other day you hear about a stabbing in London. I was talking to a mate of mine.
Yep.
You only really hear about the life-threatening ones or the murders on the news, but they're basic bog standard stabbings where people might be getting stabbed in the arm or the leg without any serious sort of repercussions. They seem to be happening daily.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you come back to stop and search, it's well, I put it like this. Okay, if you stop 100 people in the street as a police officer, you stop 100 people, right? Irrespective of what intelligence you've got, it might be intelligence led, it might be that you take a decision to stop them. 98 of them haven't got any weapons on them. Okay,
Mhm.
you've potentially upset 98 people, right? Because they're innocent, or are they innocent? They haven't got a knife on them at that particular time. Two people have got these zombie knives on them. Okay, and they get dealt with, they get arrested. So potentially you stopped 100 people, you may have stopped two murders, may
Yeah.
have stopped two murders. They've got the knives on them, they're probably going to use them, or if they don't use them, they'll be taken off them and perhaps used on them. So if they've got the knives on them, they're in play. So you've got 100 people stopped, you might have upset 98 people. So the rationale seems to be, and it seems to be, but the message you get is that, well, it's better to let two people get murdered than upset 98 people. That seems to be the message that comes through from my perspective. I
Yeah.
don't know what you think on that, but it's like,
Yeah.
well, you can't upset people. Well, okay. I mean, the other thing is, okay, those 98 people that haven't got weapons on them, yeah, they could be perfectly innocent. Or maybe some of those people, the minority, will be thinking about carrying a weapon in the future. And the fact that they've been stopped may well mean that, well, okay, I won't do it now because I could get stopped and nicked. But you can't prove that, of course. You just don't know.
No. No, I think that the table seems to, and there'll be people who will shout and scream about my opinion, but the table has flipped, the balance has shifted to appeasing the minority to the detriment of the majority.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
I
and
really, that's my honest take on things, and I don't, never going to please everyone, obviously, but something needs to change because the amount of the loss of life unnecessarily and the aggro that's going on is I think has reached an unacceptable level and things need to change.
yeah, I mean,
But nobody's got the backbone, the balls, or the stomach for the fight to do it.
well, again, there's buzzwords thrown around. I'm not that big on social media anymore, really. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn and I do the TikTok for the. I did that really to start promoting the book because the publisher wanted me to do that. But you see all these buzz phrases, people talking about leadership. Leadership. Well, all right, where is the leadership really? Where is the leadership? If you're too scared to stop and search people because of the political ramifications, then there's a problem with the leadership, whether that's the leadership in the police or whether that's the political leadership or whether it's a combination of everything. I mean, the example I gave, you stop 100 people, you find two with knives. Let's say you only find 1%, and he was definitely going to use that and murder somebody. You saved one life.
Mhm.
So the balance seems to be, as I see it, that's not good enough. You can't upset 99 people. You can't ruffle their feathers. Nobody wants to be stopped and searched. I mean, I would, if I'm stopped, I don't like it. But I mean, essentially, you got to weigh it all up and say, well, okay, if a person's life is going to be saved, if one of these poor 14 or 15-year-old kids, his life's going to be saved because 99 or 100 people have been upset, then I would say it's worth it. But of course, that is the question, isn't it? The big
Yeah.
question.
No, it's things have gone too far the other way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I don't like it that I've been told I'm a cross between bloody Victor Meldrew and Alf Garnett these days. Not to the same extent that Alf Garnett was how he was, but no, I've just turned into the the epitome of a grumpy old fart.
Oh yeah, I mean the thing is, I mean also I've got I got my daughter's, well she's old now, but I've got grandkids, 12 and
Yeah,
13. And what do you tell them really? I mean, it's all this stuff about situational awareness and all the rest of it. But quite frankly, if you've got someone running down the street with a samurai sword and you're the wrong place, the wrong time, I mean, all the situational awareness in the world ain't going to help you, is it?
no, just
Unless
be faster.
unless you're a fast runner, basically, that's it.
That's
Isn't
it. Yeah, on your toes.
it? So anyway, but yeah, just so I digressed a bit there. But yeah, so getting back to it, um, yeah, back to the sort of early 80s. I was sent to, I thought I was going to go back to Vine Street because I had got a report from the cadets, from the inspector there.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, that's cool. We'll go up to Hendon, I'll get through that. And of course, in those days, the learning was, you know, much different to what it is today. We were still doing what they call rote learning. So you'd have to learn phrases,
Yes.
law, off by heart. I mean, like the word police is one that comes to mind. I'll never forget the definition of the word police. It's stuck in my head. And if you said that to somebody today, they look at you as if you're, a bit crazy, from Mars. But the word police means generally the arrangements made in all civilized countries to ensure that the inhabitants keep the peace and obey the law. The word also denotes the force of peace officers, in brackets, or police employed for this purpose. You used to have to learn this off by heart. Now, I'm not saying that that's really necessary, but it's just an example of how disciplined it was. You had to really know this stuff. Word perfect. And
Yeah.
over a period of 16 weeks, you had a combination of that. You had what they called knowledge and reasoning, whereby you'd be given a sort of scenario and you'd have to state your action. And some of them could be quite extreme, but they're looking for a sort of logical thought process. And then you'd also have practicals as well. Now, it was very thorough. But again, I mean, today, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot going on these days talking about, having graduate entries. You must have to have you need to have a degree to go into the police. Well, they had graduate entry and a graduate entry system back then. That existed,
Yeah.
but not everybody needed to be a graduate to go into the police. I mean, the way it worked then was if they did a graduate entry system, they'd get fast tracked really through the system. So they'd only do a couple of years before they become a sergeant and went on to be an inspector, etc. But at least they did it. Um,
Yes.
you know,
Yes. There's no, it wasn't really no cutting corners. It was just
yeah.
shortening the time.
And again, these days they're talking about these direct entry sort of, I think direct entry superintendents. So you just come straight in as a superintendent because they say, well, you're a police manager. Yeah, you haven't got to really know about the nuts and bolts of policing. Well, again, that's very arguable. It depends what their role is. If you're just looking at policies and visiting sort of MPs and politicians and councillors, I suppose. But if you've got to have a decision-making process that cascades down to the people on the ground, then you sort of do need to know it, don't you? I would have thought. But anyway,
I think it would be kind of essential in order to lead people in an organization. You certainly need to have a good understanding of what they're doing of what they should be doing on a daily basis and how things need to be done and run.
I mean, the old system was every commissioner, every police commissioner started off as a constable, walking the beat. Now you could say, well, as a commissioner, that's so political. They don't need to be able to have done that. But I mean, it sort of works, I think. But there's a lot of people are going to sort of jump down this screen and say, no, that's a load of nonsense. They don't need to do this. It's much more sophisticated now. It's much more political now. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But the nuts and bolts of community policing, which is the area that I sort of focus on, is that you need to be down there on the streets, mixing with the people. You need to understand what makes the community tick that you're working in, and you need to know your job.
Yeah.
You know what you can do and what you can't do. When to arrest people, when not to arrest people. We used to have a thing called discretion. Now that seems to have gone out the window. Combined with common sense, which isn't so common anymore, is it?
No,
So
it's a dying commodity.
but yeah, so all these things, people far cleverer than me are discussing, but I can only sort of view it from my perspective. But anyway, so yeah, as I say, I was at Hendon in '81 and thought I was going to go back to Vine Street. We got about 2/3 of the way through the course, and they announced the postings. And I was going through a place known as Yankee Tango, because obviously they use the phonetic alphabet for the different divisions and districts. And because the West End of London was C division or C district, and I didn't even know there was a Y district. Where's Yankee Tango? Where's that? Anyway, it turned out to be a place called Tottenham. And the only thing I knew about Tottenham was that Glenn Hoddle was manager. So that put me at a bit of a disadvantage. Never been there before in my life.
Yeah, that's too far north for you.
Yeah. So anyway, during that time, the summer of 1981, while I was at Hendon, that's when the first Brixton riots started.
Yeah.
And I remember I started in the March of 1981, and then it was in the April that the Brixton riots started. And although they called them the Brixton riots, it was actually the whole of London, really. All the inner cities kicked off, but the epicenter of it was Brixton, I suppose it's fair to say. So that kicked off in the April of 1981. So I was was I 19 then? Yeah, yeah, I wasn't even 19 yet. I was still 18 and a half at training school. And there was a talk of actually sending a serial from Hendon. So 3 week service, they were going to send us out to the Brixton riots because there was short of people.
Yeah.
Anyway, that didn't happen, but that was the they were looking at it, you know. I mean, that would have gone horribly wrong anyway. But so that kicked off in the April of 1981. So in the summer of 1981, I finally got out of Hendon and ended up at Tottenham. As I say, I'd never been there before in my life. And there's a friend of mine called Mike, he was from, I think it's from Hertfordshire. So he'd obviously knew North East London a bit better because he lived up north. And remember, we went to the divisional commander's office because when you come out of Hendon, you go and see the divisional commander, and he welcomes you to the district. And it was at Wood Green. And as the OCU commander, I mean, I shouldn't think this happens these days, but the OCU commander wanted to meet all the new troops, you know. So we turned up, me and this kid, Mike, and they said, all right, okay, so Brett, you're going to Tottenham, and you're going to the other fella, you're going to Cheshunt, I think it was, yeah, Cheshunt. And you can see the look in my mate's face, it just sort of dropped. I said, what's that? He says, Cheshunt. He says, nothing happens here. He says, I want to go where the action is, to sort of Tottenham, you know. So he actually protested to this commander. OCU commander is like, you know, pretty high up. And to his credit, I mean, it wouldn't happen these days, would it? This OCU commander's left the office, gone out for a few minutes, come back. Okay, so I've sorted it out. You can go to Tottenham with your mate. So, you know, he actually changed the posting, you know. But I mean, you can imagine that would never happen. It never happened, you know. And
No,
that's what. But they sort of responded, you know, and that was a leader. That's a true leader, you know. The guy wanted to get stuck in, and okay then, you know, he didn't try and sort of, you know, go somewhere quiet. He wanted to go somewhere busy.
it's better to have willing participants than not.
Yeah. So we both ended up at Tottenham on a very good relief. Or it's a team. They called them reliefs in the police in those days, but it was a very good team. But again, the introduction to Tottenham in the summer of 1981 was still the last knockings of the Brixton riots, because there was outbursts of violence just breaking out all over London and in North East London where we were. So what should have happened is that when you come out of Hendon, or when you came out of Hendon, this was before they brought in these things called street duties patrols. You had like a tutor constable, and they sort of guide you from the Hendon to sort of the sort of more practical side of real policing. They didn't exist yet. They came in the following year. So basically, you should have been walking the beat with a senior constable and learning the ropes that way. But we didn't have the luxury of that because there was all this rioting going on all around the place. So they had then created these units called IRUs, which were immediate response units. And so they just dragged people off the teams and put us on these, they were like old buses, basically. They weren't even proper carriers in those days. They were like these old green bus things. And you work 4 p.m. to midnight, and all you were doing was driving around, responding to outbursts of sort of looting and violence. And that was the summer, the rest of the summer of 1981.
Okay.
And the reason they did that was because they didn't have enough. They didn't have enough sort of public order officers, because in those days it was still the SPG, the Special Patrol Group, as it was before the advent of the TSG in the 80s. So the SPG, you know, were quite robust. They had the reputation of not taking any nonsense, and but there weren't enough of them. So basically, people were getting sequestered from teams and released and stuck on these IRU units. And really, at that age, 18 and a half, 19, for that summer of 1981, we were just driving around northeast London, just dealing with these outbursts of sort of rioting and looting. And then I remember the first time, I had a brick thrown at me. It was quite surreal. I was sitting in a Panda car, I was sitting in the back of the car, and this brick just bounced off the window, and it's a funny feeling really, because you think, well, you're a bit sort of put out. You think, well, what's going on there then? Why is he throwing a brick at me? And you suddenly, you soon get into it and realise, well, it's nothing personal, is it? It's just like, it's just business, isn't it? They're just attacking, what is the uniform or the cloth, was the term they used to use.
Yes.
But that was the introduction to it. It was, the early 80s. It was wild, really, and driving around northeast London, dealing with all this stuff. And then, of course, when you weren't doing that, you'd have to get back into the groove of being like a normal, Bobby on the beat, if you like, because that didn't go away. You still had to do that. So the
No.
next day you'd be walking up the high road, and your sergeant would be saying, "Well, I want you to go out and get 3 process books today. You stick on some poor motorist for some blooming motorist offence, And of course, one day you're dealing with these, rioters. Next day you've got to be quite civil and deal with, Mr. and Mrs. Respectable, And so that was interesting, because obviously in those days you didn't realise it, but of course when you're working at a pace and you are having a roll around, obviously the adrenaline's up and all the rest of it, and then
Yeah.
you've got to quickly come down again, and it's
Yeah.
that yo-yo effect all the time. It's actually quite difficult, and obviously you talk about things, the effects of stress and the psychological side of stuff, and I think that's why a lot of the time, if people do these sort of jobs for a long period of time, it can impact on your relationships, because it takes time to come down. If you've actually been dealing with violent people, violent scenarios, then you've got to
Yeah.
suddenly go home and switch off and be Mr. Nice Guy. It can be hard. There's a real psychological effect of. I certainly think doing a job, and it's not just the police, it's any of the emergency services, or even in the private sector now, because a lot of the private sector's taken over some of the traditional policing roles. But if you're
Yes.
exposed to that on a continuous basis, it definitely has the effect accumulates over a number of years. And this is some of the sort of stuff that you deal with, isn't it?
It can't not have an effect on you. It's there's one that what in your is it chapter 6, baby fathers.
Yeah.
That's you're having to go into a situation. I'll let you explain it, but
Sure.
you're going into a situation expecting one thing, but then having obviously you had a fair bit of experience at that point, I think.
Yeah. It's the mid-90s, yeah.
Yeah, so you had life experience as well as kind of work experience to,
Yes.
to allow you to make that quick shift,
Mm.
that kind of saved the situation really.
And this comes down to, again, discretion. And I don't think these days you're allowed to have any discretion. That's the
No.
problem. And I think everyone suffers. I think it makes it more difficult for the police officer. I mean, I understand why they've tightened it up to a certain degree, insofar as they want to close all the gaps. But the nature of policing is that you're dealing with human beings. It's about having
Yes.
an interaction. And baby fathers. I mean, that happened in the mid-90s. So what happened there was, I was Lewisham Division. There's a place called Brockley, and it was a Sunday, as I recall, and I was on duty with a pal, ex-Navy guy, and you have all these characters on the teams. You have a real mixture of people. That's what I liked about it. You'd have your ex-servicemen, you'd have your ex-builders, you'd have all sorts of people, and you might have your ex sort of office people as well. But you all came together and worked as a team and realised what your strengths and weaknesses were. But this guy I was with, he was a good guy. He was quite handy, and we were sitting there, and this call came up over the radio, and it was about it was a domestic disturbance, and we were listening, and they'd assigned 2 local units to it. So the units had been assigned to it. Wasn't really any of our business, but we weren't that far away. And basically, the information over the radio was that a guy returned to his former address. He wanted to see his kid. The ex-partner was in the house, wouldn't let him in. and he was starting to make a bit of a noise outside. You know, he couldn't get into the house. It was like a porch, but he was banging on the porch, making a bit of a nuisance of himself. He hadn't caused any damage or anything. He'd just been a bit noisy. So she called the police, understandably. So the local unit turned up, and it was one of these, like, I mean, Southeast London, you've got a real mishmash now, but you had there's terraced houses. It was like an old council estate, terraced houses, individual houses with like a pathway and gates on the road. Now, quite a narrow street. So we were listening to it over the radio, and the two guys that were there were saying, well, you know, maybe we better call the TSG, you know, Territorial Support Group, Republic Order Unit, because obviously they'd have shields and other bits of kit. Somebody even mentioned about calling an ARV at that time, which was an armed response vehicle. And it was going on like this. And I thought, I was listening to it, I was talking to my mate. I said, well, nothing's actually happened, has it? I mean, shall we just go down there? Because it was just the two from Brockley. We'll go and back them up. Maybe if there's four of us there, we can sort it out without anything getting too silly. So anyway, we've gone down there, and this was the mid-90s. So in the mid-90s, we just had body armor, I think, issued, the Met vests, and we used to have these long acrylic battens, the long overt battens, not like the short asps that you see now. And I used to wear this thing across my left side, so I'd cross draw it just for distance, rather than not even so much about hitting people, just because it was long, I'd use it to create distance. So I used to have this thing along my left side, and we turned up, and the two units from Brockley were plotted up just outside the gate. So I got out with my mate. I said, well, what's happening then? So the fella there said, oh, he's down there. He wants to see his kid. You know, obviously the woman's scared. There's a custody issue. You know, he's not going to see the kid now. Obviously, we need to sort of basically remove him. I thought, okay. So I was watching him, and this guy was pacing around, and didn't have any obvious weapons or anything, nothing in his hands. Couldn't see anything, you know, around his waistband or anything. And I just said, you know what? I'll go and have a chat with him. And they were saying, oh, well, you know, maybe you should wait, get the TSG. I said, I'll go and have a chat with him. Not a problem. And at that time, as you say from the book, I mean, at that time, I wasn't with the mother of my daughter. We'd split up. Now, my daughter was living with her gran, actually, in South London. And obviously, she was being well looked after, and there was no issues there. I'd see her on a regular basis, but I wasn't living under the same roof as her. So I didn't really like that, you know, as most blokes wouldn't, you know, I didn't, you know, didn't like that situation. So that was where I was in my private life. So anyway, I've gone down there, and this guy, he was sort of pacing around, and I approached him. I was looking at his hands, looking at his pockets, couldn't see any bulges, couldn't see any obvious weapon. His hands were sort of empty. So I've gone up to him and said, listen, I said, let's have a word. And he sort of looked at me, and he looked me up and down, you know, and all the rest of it. I said, listen, you're not going to see your daughter today, mate. I said, listen, it's too late. You're going to have to go. So he just ignored me, and he's looked around again, and he's looking towards the porch. And I said, listen, my friend, I said, seriously, just stop this now. Not going to be a problem. We'll escort you out of the area, and that'll be the end of it. But you're not going to see your daughter today. But he just said to me, I need to see my daughter. I'm seeing my daughter. I says, no, you're not seeing your daughter. I said, you're not seeing her today. I said, it's gone too far. So then he's come up to me, he's like nose to nose. He said, you don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like, you know, right in my face. So of course that's just hit a nerve then, isn't it? I said, what? And I've given it back. I don't know what it's like. I know exactly what it's like. And listen, you're not seeing your daughter today. You're leaving with me now. And he just sort of, he was stunned, you know. I shouted a bit louder than that, I might add, but I don't want to scare the Anyway, so he sort of he stopped dead in his tracks, and he sort of looked down, looked around, and he just sort of looked at me and went, oh, okay, he went, and he mumbled under his breath, you good policeman. I said, yeah, okay then, let's go. So I've escorted him out of there, down the path to the end, and of course got him outside of the gate. And my mates come along and say, yeah, but you're not going back, are you? Because obviously the danger was if we just didn't nick him, he'd go back and start again. No, I'm not going to go back. Are you sure? So to cut a very long story short, we were there for a while. We escorted him right out of the area. And when we were sure that he wasn't going to go back, not that we could be really 100% sure, but in our minds, we were convinced he wasn't going to. That's what we did. And if he didn't go back, and he didn't cause any more problems. Now, you know, other people would listen to that, and I could see them jumping through the screens. Oh, no, you know, he should have been, all the rest of it, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's an argument to say he should have been. But the point is, that was an example of judgment and discretion that worked. Now, okay, it could have gone horribly wrong. Let's be totally honest. It could have gone horribly wrong, but it didn't. But that's all about your own personal judgment, isn't it? And sizing up a person and making a decision.
Yes.
Everyone's different, and that's one example of using your discretion and using your judgment, and perhaps not always going down that totally authoritative sort of path. I mean, that's the example, of baby fathers. That's the chapter there. But
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily a bad bloke, just a shit situation and not handling it very well.
yeah,
Like a lot of people, if there was more discretion, I think that there would be yeah, a fair reduction in workload if more discretion was allowed because of that sort of thing.
I mean, we don't know what was going on in his world, do we? That's the thing.
No, no, not at all.
Um,
No, people do all sorts of weird, stupid stuff because of
mm,
they're not coping with their life situation,
yeah.
or they've got a genuine mental illness. They could have some
Mm,
genuine psychological issue that's not being dealt with.
exactly. I mean that incident took place when I was in my mid-30s. So
Yeah,
obviously that's, as you say, that's a lot further down the line. So to try and deal with that at 18 or 19, no, it wouldn't have worked. It
no,
wouldn't have worked because I wouldn't have had that experience myself. So but yeah, I mean, so again, rewinding again, going back to the early 80s and Tottenham. So went through the Tottenham phase, and at that time, my well, he wasn't quite my father-in-law. He was my fiance's dad, he was very close to me. He was suffering from cancer.
hmm
So what happened then was I was living in Tottenham, and I was travelling backwards and forwards to southeast London, and of course in those days didn't have a car, and the public transport system was a bit more disconnected than it is now. So it was very difficult to get backwards and forwards. So again, to cut a long story short with that, one of the suggestions was, well, would you be better off perhaps transferring to a station south of the river so that you make it a bit easier for you? Because I was sort of helping out, with that situation. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I mean, Tottenham was rough, but I sort of knew the ropes there, and I wasn't sure if I transferred, if I'd be sort of, you know, out of the pan into the fryer, sort of thing, into the fire. So I thought about it and stayed at Tottenham for a while, and cracked on with that. And eventually, to cut a long story short, again, I transferred down to South London. So I thought, well, okay, my father-in-law lives in Eltham, as it was there. They'll probably send me somewhere, around there. And I know the streets, I know the area. So of course, transfer came through. You go to a place called Mike. Where the hell was that then? Anyway, that turned out to be Peckham. So it was even rougher than Tottenham. I mean, in Tottenham, you had the Broadwater Farm Estate. So
yeah,
I'd got used to that. Now, the Broadwater Farm Estate, obviously, they had the big riot in 85. I wasn't there then. But I mean, I remember the first time I went down to the Broadwater Farm Estate. Because in Tottenham, you got these like roads with, tree-lined avenues with Victorian houses. And then Broadwater Farm Estate is at the end of one of these roads. You go down this road, and suddenly it goes from this sort of little sort of these streets with Victorian houses to this it's like an island fortress, really. It was then the Broadwater Farm Estate, and they had all these walkways and blocks, and all the blocks were named after sort of World War II air bases. You had like Debden and Tangmere and all this sort of stuff. It was a
yeah,
strange old environment, and quite often when you'd walk down there in police uniform, you wouldn't see anybody. But you could bet your bottom dollar they could see you. The observers were there. It was a bit like
yes.
some out of Escape from New York. We've seen the old film there, but it was that sort of thing. But I mean, obviously, ultimately, it ended up in a massive riot where a police officer was killed. A couple of years later. But the thing about the Broadwater Farm Estate was it was like an isolated island in the middle of that part of Tottenham.
Yeah,
But got to Peckham, and again, I was still a kid. I was still 19, 20, whatever it was. And I remember sitting down in the office with the duty sergeant, and I mean, 40 odd years ago, we're talking about, aren't we? And he had this little half wheelbarrow moustache, and he sat there, his little glasses, looking over the desk. And he went, yeah, he says, trouble is you're going on a wanky relief. Oh, great, here we go, sort of thing. What does that mean? What does that even mean exactly? You know, sort of, don't need that. You know, it's hard enough as it is. So they said, okay, we're gonna assign you to somebody to take you around Peckham. So we've gone out of Peckham, Nick, walked down Peckham High Street, and in those days, there was this a road, was it Sumner Road? And we did a left up Sumner Road, and we went on to what was then the North Peckham estate. Now, I'll tell you what, I mean, it made the Broadwater Farm estate look like sort of Buckingham Palace, you know. I mean, it's unbelievable, and it was a vast expanse, so it wasn't a contained area. It
Yeah.
was, it was covered. It was over a massive area, so it was a lot easier to get lost. You had all these walkways, and I remember that you walked along this walkway and you saw these flats down to the side, and they'd like bars on the windows, and you think, let me know. I mean, it looked like a prison, you know. It was unbelievable, and it's just they've knocked a lot of it down now, you know, and you can understand why, because when you talk about, you know, deprivation, social deprivation, people talk about this stuff, but unless you really see it, you think, well, people actually live in that, live
Yeah.
in places, and it was horrible, you know. And again, you know, walking around that place, the Brixton riots and that sort of thing had finished, but you're just dealing with bog standard policing, and it was, you know, quite a depressing place, you know. But I
Yeah.
say that went on for some time, but again, still very young, having to deal with that stuff on a regular basis. And yeah, I remember one incident. We got a call. And it was a coach had come down from Victoria on the way down to Dover, I think it was. And they said, "Oh, gunshots, sound of gunshots." Now, of course, these days you'd have an ARV, you'd have SO19, you'd have everything. You didn't have that back then, you know. And I just happened to be wandering along the high street, turned up, and this coach had all its windows sort of had been blown out, you know. So again, in the end, they thought it was like very high power air weapons, like these German ones that they had in the 1980s that actually did it. They weren't sure what did it, but it was like pellet type things that caused the
Yeah.
damage. I mean, but again, you're on your own, really. You didn't have, you know, in hindsight, the backup that you'd have, you got in later years. That was the thing. But you know, I mean, so really, as a young person working you had to be able to work in a team, but a lot of the time you'd be working on your own. So, you know, it's tough. And if you fast forward to today and you think, well, okay, so how are people prepared for that? But the thing is, these days you don't really see people walking the beat, do you? That's the thing.
Not really, not very often, no.
You don't see it. So all you really get is a response vehicle if you're lucky. So I suppose to answer that question is it's very rare that you have a lone officer walking the beat. So you know, that's food for thought. But yeah, so that was my introduction really to the police, you know, back in those early 80s. And obviously the book skips through because I did that. I went into the private sector, and then I rejoined the police. But so again, the first part, Tottenham and Peckham, and the second part, when we get to the early to mid 90s, was
Mhm.
Lewisham and Deptford division. Where
Yeah.
again, I'm now in my 30s and almost sort of reborn in that role, you know. So I actually looked at things very differently. So you had the things like baby fathers, you had a lot of the other scenarios that happened. Um, yeah, Conan the Librarian was one of the chapters. But I mean, again,
Yes.
that's an interesting one when we talk about sort of supervision. And again, when we talk about actually, when you think about that particular story, the guy was actually all right. He actually learned. He learned from the experience. But the situation now is you do look and you think, well, okay, will a lot of these supervisors actually go through that sort of experience? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And I think that's again one of the issues you got to deal with. It's all about actually going through the sort of the mill really, and actually understanding how that job works on, you know, at street level. But yeah, you know, but I mean, I saw a survey the other day, and it said when it comes to traumatic incidents, the average person in the emergency services, whether it's the police or the fire brigade or the paramedics, they could be exposed to between 400 to 600 traumatic incidents if they stay in for a long period of time, like 20 or 30 years, whatever. Whereas the average person in the whole lifetime may witness 4 to 6
Yeah.
incidents. You know, I don't know how true that is, but I mean, certainly, I don't know if the numbers are totally right, but you certainly would be exposed to a lot more having done one of those roles. And that again has got to have an accumulative effect on you, isn't it? Psychologically, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, it has to. And I mean, things have changed to a degree, but I mean, I don't imagine there was much in the way of support in the 80s and 90s, particularly the 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
For it was kind of shut the fuck up and get on with it, really, wasn't it?
Very, very much so. Very much so. I mean, you know, like there's one chapter in there, again, going back to the 80s called The Moaning Man. And
Hmm.
again, this was an interesting one. I was again 18, 19, and it was a night duty, and it was a beautiful summer's night. And I was with a guy called Dave, who was an old sweat, and he was a really good guy, actually. I called him Don in the book, but it doesn't really matter. But he was a really cool guy. And it was one of the rare occasions when I wasn't walking the beat. I was actually the operator on a van. And we started night duty, and we had a briefing, and the information we had was that there'd been a murder where a woman had been murdered in her flat, and the suspect was her ex-partner. He'd stabbed her.
Yeah.
David had given a brief description. That was it. Okay, you know, and that was in that was actually yeah, that was East Dulwich's ground. It was East Dulwich's ground because at Peckham and East Dulwich they were like sister nicks. And so we went about our night duty. Not much happened. It was fairly quiet all night. Got to about 6 o'clock in the morning. We're driving down the road back to the nick. It's a summer's morning, so it was quite warm. The guy sitting on the pavement, no shirt on, just rocking, sitting there rocking, big long dreadlocks. So I thought, okay, what's this then? So we stopped in the van, got out, and he's on the pavement, sort of moaning and murmuring and all the rest of it. And I couldn't see what was wrong with him. We thought he was either drugged up or he'd had a drink or something, you know. Wasn't quite sure. You know, I
Yeah.
got close to him and I saw something protruding out the side. He had these big long dreadlocks, and I saw something protruding out the side of his dreadlock. Anyway, I sort of moved the dreadlock to one side, and all I could see was the black handle of a lock knife or a flick knife sticking out of his neck. Just the handle, nothing else. No blood, nothing. Just the handle sticking out of the neck. Whoa, okay. So what do? You know, keep him still, don't you? Immobilize him. You don't do anything really. Just keep him still, immobilize him, and call an ambulance. So it transpired that this guy was the murderer. He's the one who murdered his girlfriend the night before,
Yeah.
and he then well, he failed in his attempts to take his own life because he stabbed himself in the neck, but he missed all the vitals. He missed the jugular, he missed the carotid artery. I don't know how he did, but he's just caught the muscle, I think, and he's basically stabbed himself right up to the hilt, and that was it. So he got simultaneously, you know, arrested for murder and taken to hospital. But I mean, the thing is, again, I, I can't say I felt really bothered by that incident, but I mean, again, over the years, you think about it, and it's not that I feel particularly bothered by it, but you think about it. So we don't know if we're affected by that or not, do we? Seeing things like that, ultimately, you know, I mean,
No, I mean, it's. I think you do get used to that sort of thing. There's other cases that you talk about, and well, it's chapter one, the case of Emma.
yeah,
That kind of it's that sort of thing that kind of catches you more, I think, isn't it?
very much so. I mean, you know, we talk about murder, suicide, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, that one again, Emma. We fast forward again to the mid-90s. I'm in my 30s again, and we got a call. There was another. I think it was a Sunday. It was a Sunday afternoon, and missing person. Okay, missing person. What's this then? So parents had phoned up the police and said their daughter had gone missing. Okay, how old's the daughter? 30. Right. When was the last time you heard from her? Thursday. 30-year-old woman, you know, they haven't heard from her from Thursday. It's been the weekend and now it's Sunday. Well, you know, she could have been out having a party or whatever, couldn't she? You know, anything's possible. So we didn't, I thought, really? But the parents apparently are adamant to the controller that it's very unusual and that she contacts them, you know, every day or every other day, and they're worried. Okay. So we've gone round to this address. and it was a low-level sort of masonette type place, not far from the police station. We got out with my mate and we had a look, you know, looked through the windows, knocked on the door. No smell coming out of the letterbox. So there's nothing, you know, nothing seemed to be disturbed. So really, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, she was apparently not in, but anyway, it was decided that no, you know, they're really worried. So eventually we forced our way into the apartment. We kicked the door in basically. And the thing about that is, especially in those days, that's all well and good, but if there's nothing wrong, then you're responsible for securing the premises. And in those days, you'd have to guard the premises until the boarding up service came. So you'd have to stand there, and then obviously you're out of commission then until the boarding up service came. So you're 2 unit or 1 unit down on the team, and basically it's a bit of a waste of time. Plus, you'd have to pay for the damage. So anyway, the duty inspector, she was pretty switched on. She made the decision, saying, "No, go in there and see, you know, just investigate." So we've gone in there, and I think I always remember it. You got like a kitchen diner area, and then down to the right, there's a corridor that led to what was the bedrooms. And halfway down the corridor, there was like a wardrobe door that was open. So all you could see was the door. Okay, so we shouted police, gone down there. It was fairly dark in there. It wasn't that brightly lit. Got up to the doorway, put my head round, and there's obviously a human figure there. So bit of a jump. I thought it was a burglar hiding there at first. And anyway, so I've looked again because I was in front, my mate was behind me, and I've looked in. I could see the figure of a female, and she was crouched down in the wardrobe, and her hand was literally like that, and she had these like big blue eyes, and she was like looking up at me, and she's just like that. And I've looked closer, and of course there's a ligature around her neck that was strung up to the top of this wardrobe. You know, good old-fashioned wardrobe, not like the modern ones that would just collapse. But anyway, she was strung up
Yeah.
against this, and eyes wide open, and her hand was like that, almost as if she'd had a touch of the seconds, and she tried to change her mind, and of course it was too late. So anyway, there was a few seconds of just standing there looking at her, and we had a look around. We couldn't see, you know, there's nothing, you know, coming out of it, nothing in her back or anything. Couldn't see any sort of visible injuries. So we took the decision to just to take her down just in case there was any life there, but there wasn't. She was dead, and we put her on the bed, and she was like, you know, rigor mortis had set in, and all the rest of it. So yeah, she turned out to be a nurse. So, you know, we're talking about emergency services. She was a nurse. And back in those days, this was before they had the hoists to lift patients up. They used to manually lift patients and move them in and out of the bed. So
Yeah.
she basically injured her back about 10 months before this. And she was off sick, and she had a bad back, and she basically suffered from depression. And, you know, eventually, you know, she took her own life, and she hung herself, they reckon, about 10 hours before. So it probably would have been Saturday night, Sunday morning. But again, the point about that is that one sticks in my mind. Just finding that girl with the big blue eyes. Again, no blood or snot or nothing like that. It's just the human side of that. Just looking at her and finding her like that. And then of course, because I found her, I then had to go to coroner's court and, you know, meet the parents and relay everything that happened. And, you know, I mean, again, that, you know, you've got to be a bit of a hard git not to have something like that affect you, really. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I found that, bearing in mind, you know, when in those areas we dealt with lots of sudden deaths. It's not like
Yeah.
that's the only sudden death you deal with. I've dealt with lots of them, but in some cases, advanced, you know, states of decomposition where you can't even recognise a body. You know,
Yeah.
and that's when in those days we talk about, you know, black humour and stuff like that, which people would recoil at. But I mean, you have to have a sort of survival mechanism to actually get through dealing with those sort of things, don't you? And
Absolutely. Yes, you do.
another
Yeah.
thing, people who haven't been in these roles, they don't get it. They don't understand it. You know, that's the thing.
No.
But again, yeah, just finding her, that one sticks in the mind. You know, just finding her. I mean, she was, and also she was again another real a victim of, you know, working in the emergency services. Really, I mean, she was a nurse. Okay, she wasn't injured as such by a suspect, but she got a bad back by doing her job, didn't she? By
Yeah.
lifting patients up. So again, that was a that was a rough one. But yeah. So again, that incident happened in the mid-90s. So the book, you know, we're talking about 1980 right up to about 1997, which is when I finally sort of moved on, so to speak. Um,
What spurred the move on?
well, we're talking about policing today and policing then. In my mind, by the time we got to the mid-90s, there's a few incidents that happened that made me think that, you know what, I'd quite like to be armed, I think. And by that, I mean have a firearm. And it's interesting because there's so much talk about, you know, whether police should have firearms, whether they shouldn't have, whether they should be routinely armed. Well, I think, you know, you could argue that there is always an individual decision there. You can actually apply to a firearms unit to be a firearms officer. But I just found, I mean, there's a couple of incidents, and there was one that happened. Well, there's so many. There's the Conan one, and there was the one on Aragon Babel, and they kept happening. And there was the one, the final one up the creek. So you're dealing with these people armed with baseball bats and knives, and you know it's all well and good having CS spray and all the rest of it. But to be honest, I never used it. I just used my hands and feet most of the time, you know. And arguably that, you know, that probably wasn't always the best way to deal with it. But essentially, I tended to use my speed and decisiveness to deal with situations. Now the thing is, sooner or later you're going to come unstuck. It's going to work up to a point. And I personally felt I got to that point in 1997 where I thought, you know what, I'd quite like to have a firearm. So then I looked at the different options. You obviously got your SO19 or SCO19. You've got your TSG type units where they do have a capability to be armed, or you had like the protection side of it. So I went for the protection side of it simply because I thought, well, okay, it's a sort of a compromise, you know. You're not living and breathing guns 24/7, but at least you got the option to carry one. And my initial plan was to do a couple of years there and then maybe come back to some sort of divisional role. But what happens is, I think if you've done policing in an unarmed capacity and then you go to carry a firearm, albeit whether it doesn't really matter what level, because there's different levels of firearms officers. But once you've been trained as an AFO, there's not many people really that want to go back to doing an unarmed police role in the front line, if that makes sense. You might want to go back to a role where you're not in the front line and you're not carrying. Yeah, fair enough. But I don't know that many people that really want to revert back to a frontline role where you're not carrying a firearm after you got used to carrying it. And of course,
Well, yeah.
I'm talking about, you know, we're talking 1997. That was a long time ago now. And that argument the argument is still rumbling on, isn't it? About whether to have, you know, routinely armed police officers, you know, or whether not to have it. I mean, now obviously Taser came in, and that's a compromise. But again, Tasers, they're okay up to a point. But I mean, we saw the incident the other day, didn't we, with that lunatic with a sword?
Yeah.
He got taken out of a Taser. Well, you know, big respect to the officer that took him out of the Taser, because, you know, they're not foolproof. All right, you could say a firearm's not foolproof. But if you've got somebody who's already killed a person waving a samurai sword around, I think the preferred method would be to shoot him, quite frankly. But there you go.
Well,
Hats
yeah,
off
I think,
hats off to that officer for doing what she did with the Taser. You know, well done.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, glad that it was done, but I think it should have been done sooner.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
mean,
it's you know, it's all well and good watching the snippets on social media, but being in the moment, it's not always you can't always do it when you'd want to, can you?
no,
The
no.
opportunity just isn't there.
I mean, I was one of the things that happened to me is I went to Florida, and I got invited out with the because I was an officer safety instructor, so I did that for about 20 years, both on division and when I went up to royalty protection. I was an officer safety trainer, so my specialism really was empty hand techniques and less than lethal options.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really sort of struck me is when I went to Florida. I went over there. I was an officer safety trainer. I was invited over there by an officer safety trainer in Florida, and it was in a place called Jacksonville, and this was in 1995. And I turned up at the police headquarters, and obviously met them all. And you know, you have to get your head around the fact that everyone's armed with firearms, and obviously more than one firearm. You'd have a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, and every incident you go to is dealt with by armed officers. And once you get your head around that, you get used to it. It then becomes normal.
Yeah.
So in the UK, it's like normal not to be armed. And the issue is we always seem to get compared, or the UK always seems to get compared to the US. But of course, I mean, why is that? I mean, why not compare it to Europe? I mean, I live in Malta, and the firearms laws here are fairly relaxed. I mean, we'll come on to that a bit later, but essentially, if you're of good character, right, you go to a doctor and they certify that there's nothing wrong with you upstairs, and you haven't got a criminal record. You do a course, a theory course and a practical sort of course. You go to the police, you do a test, you get a license, you can have a firearm. You can have many firearms. Now, the thing is, in Malta, we don't have much firearms crime. I mean, and the firearms crime we do have is not with licensed weapons; it's with illegally obtained weapons.
Yeah.
Which is obviously the same in the UK. It's very, there's not that many occasions where licensed weapons are used in crime. So, again, the comparison is always with the US, but there are lots of other European countries where people can have access to firearms. We haven't got people going around shooting everyone every day. So again, you're talking about mental health. Mental health is a big issue, and as we know, if somebody is that way inclined, if they haven't got a gun, they'll get a knife or a sword. If they haven't got that, they'll get a vehicle and they'll run someone over.
Yeah. There's always a way.
Yeah. So again, but no, in Florida, obviously, I got to see it firsthand, and again, there was no, when I was there was nothing excessive. There's no visible, use of excessive force. Obviously, there could be. I suppose there may well have been at some point, but I mean, I certainly didn't see it. And the thing is, it's about discipline of the person, isn't it? And my view is, at the end of the day, I prefer to have the option to use it than not have it. And once you've carried a firearm, I think it's very difficult to actually go back to a frontline policing role and not carry a firearm. That's me speaking, personally, really. Other people think differently. Other people say, no, we'll never carry a firearm. Well, then you get the situation where people say, oh, I wouldn't trust him with a firearm. I wouldn't trust him with that. I wouldn't trust him with that, or her with that. Well, then you've got to look at that person then. Maybe they're not quite right for that role then, really. Because like in Malta, for example, when they do their initial training, they do use firearms in initial training, even if they don't carry them afterwards. So everybody's familiarised with them.
Yeah.
And I think really, there's still, in the UK, there's still a lot of people, police officers, who've never seen a firearm, never picked up a firearm. You need to know how they work, I think, in case something does happen. I mean, basic firearms awareness training. You've got to know what the capabilities are, the safe distances, the safe, distance, cover from view, cover from fire, that sort of stuff. You need to be aware of that. And you do question how some of them, whether or not some of them, would know that,
Yeah. I mean, that incident in Australia,
Yeah.
that police officer killed that guy. That was a knife, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Stabbed about, was it 5 people?
Yeah.
Or more? Yeah. Why? Yeah, you've got to be able to up the ante. Don't take a knife to a knife fight. Take a gun.
Exactly.
The whole point is to suppress the threat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll ever really change in the UK. I think what they've tried to go for a compromise, really, so you've got more ARVs. I mean, I suppose what you want really is a situation where each area car, I don't know if they still use that terminology, but if you've got an armed area car, so you've got on each area at least one unit that's got firearms capability that's accessible to everywhere on the ground. That would be something. But again, you've got fewer and fewer police officers, haven't you? Since 2010, they've cut them by 20,000. And there's all this talk about replenishing them. Well, okay, even if you bring back the 20,000 you got rid of, then you need to get another probably 10,000 to get it up to a number where you've got enough to actually deal with it all.
I mean, can you imagine if something like October 7th happened in the UK? There'd be it'd just be a walk in the park, wouldn't it, really?
I mean, I mean, one of the, you've only got one of these shopping centres here, haven't you? Something like that, it's just
crazy.
Yeah.
So how did you notice any change in well, a couple of things. any changes in yourself from, from the 80s into the 90s in dealing with the things that you had, but not having any kind of support to help you deal with it?
Well, I think, as you said, in the early 80s, I mean, no matter what role you were in, you didn't really get any support in any area, did you? So I think that what I noticed was obviously being very young. I mean, 18, 19, and then going in to deal with something at that age, and then fast forwarding to say your mid 30s, obviously you've matured as a person as well as gaining more experience. And by that time, there was more support. I mean, for example, when my dad died, they gave me I was a firearms officer then. They gave me a counsellor then, and I didn't even think I needed it. But in retrospect, that was probably a good thing. So
Yeah,
I do think that it's certainly got better over the years, as
yeah,
it has in every era. But I mean, at 18, 19. Um, you're immature anyway, aren't you? Really, let's be honest. I mean, you're not fully developed. So, but then when you get to your 30s, obviously you're more worldly wise, and just coincidentally, the world has developed as well, and the support had got better by that time. I suppose these days there is more support out there, but there's still not enough, is there? That's the truth.
well, yeah, it's, and again, like the police, it's the mental health services in the UK are massively underfunded, under resourced. They haven't got enough people.
Mm,
They're going off sick because they're overworked and overwhelmed. And they do a fantastic job, but they just can't do it on the scale or to the level that's necessary for the population. It's unworkable.
And it seems to be down to a lot of it these days is down to individuals, isn't it? People like yourself and others who are actually setting up initiatives to actually be proactive and actually do it, if you like, unofficially.
Yeah, yeah, to support the system because the system can't cope because it's like with everything. Mental health is very poorly managed from the top down. The people that actually deliver the work are phenomenal people.
Mm,
They're and I feel for them because the same as I feel for police officers. And anyone in those sorts of services because they just don't have the resources to
mm.
do what they know they need to do. It's yeah. I mean, I think British politics needs to pull its head out of his arse and start serving the public rather than serving themselves.
Indeed.
Just being overly cynical.
You go down the political road, it'll be a long conversation, won't it? I don't know. Wouldn't know where to start with that one.
No,
But
go on,
I
no,
mean,
no.
yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, going back to your question there, then, I mean, in relation to deciding that I wanted to actually get away from that. I suppose the last incident would have been in about 96, 97, where we got called to. We didn't get called actually. It was a warrant inquiry. What we used to do is on a Sunday morning, we used to get the warrants of wanted people that had sort of gone adrift and try and find them. So it was
Okay,
one Sunday morning. We had a few of these warrants, and we checked a few addresses. And we went to this place. It was on the border of Deptford and Greenwich's ground, off a Creek Road, place called Creek Road, and block of flats, long sort of balcony, and went down there. 6 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door, no answer. Tried to peer through the window to the side, couldn't see anything. Then we heard something behind the door, some sort of movement. Um, Knocked on the door again, um, like shuffling movement up and down the corridor. So there's obviously somebody in there. So okay, well, whether or not it's the person we were looking for, we didn't know, but we hung about there. And eventually, this door opened, and as the door opened, just this knife this knife appeared in the doorway. So that was a bit of a clue that perhaps the guy didn't want to come quietly. So there we go.
so
It's sort of in play. So we obviously stood back to. I was with another fellow. Obviously, didn't want to be in the line of fire, so we got back from the doorway and heard a shuffling noise again. So he appeared to be going further down into the apartment. So I think my mate got his asp out and ready with the sear spray and all the rest of it. Pushed the door open, stepped back, and the guy was gone back to the back of the sort of hallway he still had the knife in his hand. He's gone down, he's picked his baseball bat up, you know. Hence the title, Balconies, Knives and Baseball Bats, you know, the subtitle for the book.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he's standing there, and it went on for a couple of minutes, and eventually he's come towards the doorway. You know, I won't go into too many details, but we overpowered him and arrested him.
Yeah.
And this guy, he turned out to be a prolific burglar, and he's out there in the public domain. The publishers told me to change all the names, but this guy's name is out there, and his claim to fame was that he'd once burgled the oldest woman in England, and he got a measly sentence for that. He was released. He was a prolific burglar, and he used to specialise in intimidating elderly people, elderly residents. He'd go around and burgle them, and we nicked him in 96, 97, and I then, a few years later, 2016, I got a press clipping sent to me about this fella, whereby he'd been arrested again, similar sort of thing, burgled a load of old women again, and I think he finally got 8 years or something in 2016. But he must be out by now again, unless he's got nicked again. But I mean, the point is, you know, it was me and my mate Matt. I mean, you know, we were quite fit fellas, and at the end of the day, quite, you know, capable. And he's quite happy to pull a baseball bat and knife on us, you know. And you think, well, if it had been lesser people, it could have gone horribly wrong. And the fact is, you know, we dealt with it. But that one stuck in my mind because it was just another incident, another one, another almost something that becomes routine when you're dealing with these sort of people. Now, sooner or later, your luck's going to run out, isn't it? I don't care who you are. You
Yeah.
know,
Absolutely.
I know somebody who's been stabbed. I knew somebody who was shot dead and on duty, and they, you know, I mentioned it in the book. Capable guy. So, you know, it can happen to anyone. And I just felt at that point, you know what, I personally would like to even up the odds, and that was why I then took steps to, you know, at least do a firearms course and become a firearms officer, and then that's what I did. But yeah, but that was in 1997, so it's a lot worse now, isn't it? Really, arguably.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. I
So
think
yeah, I mean, I suppose so. Fast forwarding, then I joined royalty protection. I mean, my main sort of area of proficiency in there was still as an officer safety instructor. So I used to specialise in teaching empty hand techniques, the less than lethal options. Obviously, there's in those days there were 3 sections to royalty protection. I sort of traversed all of them in relation to officer safety. Finally retired the end of 2014, 2015. I got as far as I call it, I got the silver medal. I got the 25-year pension. Didn't quite get the gold medal, the 30-year pension, but I'm still quite happy with that. Managed to escape the long service in good conduct and undetected crime for 25 years. So I managed.
long service and uncaught.
That's right. So managed to get away with that. And prior to that, from 2012 onwards, I've been coming over to Malta, doing some training and teaching. And I've formed a business partnership with a guy over here who had this dojo, and which was called the Warriors Heart Academy. So I joined forces with him, Alfred, and from March 2015, I started teaching here. I mean, my area was really kickboxing and personal safety training, and so at the academy we're doing combat sports, martial arts, and firearms training. Now, the firearms training over here is really for the local market licensing, but at the same time, we have people come over from abroad to shoot. So, for example, if you wanted to come over, get some rounds down the range, you can do that. We're qualified range officers, and we have instructors. I've got one XSO19 guy who helps out every now and then. And so we do that. We get groups come over from England. We're not into, you know, this sort of official training for CP and all the rest of it. It's just literally you come over and you want to do a few rounds, we can have a shoot. If you've got people in that industry, they want to do certain types of shoots, we can do that. Obviously, we can cater for that. But the only licensing we do with regards to courses is for the local market. So, for example, if you're a Maltese resident, you've got an ID card and you want to have a firearm, as I say, you come to our place, we do the course. It's an academic course in the classroom. Then we take you on the range. We go through the NSPs, basic safety, just to make sure, you know, you're not a complete problem person. And then do a few rounds. Then we send you off to the police. They look at you. They give you a theory test, and then you get your license. So anybody can do that in Malta. So that's quite good. If you want to come over as a non-Maltese resident on a range day, we can take you on the range. You can shoot pretty much anything up to, you know, we don't, they're not allowed to shoot fully auto, but you know, you don't, who needs that? Essentially, you can shoot a wide range of weapons. So that comes under the Warriors Heart Academy. The combat sports and martial arts does. And the other side of it is Pro Force One Malta, which is the security company and the security training academy. So
Yeah.
the way that works is in Malta, to get a private guard license, similar to the UK, insofar as in the UK you do an SRA license. In Malta, you do a license, private guard license, but it comes directly under the Malta police. So there's no intermediary body. So in Malta, you have there's four categories to the license. So you've got private guard license, you've got the entertainment license, which would be the door supervisor one, and then you've got specialist guard driving, specialist guard non-driving. So they don't have like a specific CP license or anything like that. That would come under a specialist guard sort of license.
Yeah.
So we do that on the academy side, and we have a security company where we do, you know, ad hoc jobs. Really, we don't do any like big jobs over here, but if jobs come up, we can provide people in Malta. Also, myself and a few of the others, we've got the UK SIA licenses. So should anything come up in the UK, I do the odd job over there. I can go over there because obviously the money you get in the UK is better than you get in Malta or any Mediterranean island. So essentially, you've got the Warriors Art Academy and Pro Force One Malta. So you've got the dojo, which is the combat sports, martial arts, and firearms training. And then you've got the Pro Force One Malta Security Company and Security Training Academy. So it's all under the same roof in a place called Mosta, which is in the centre of Malta.
And you're training competitive fighters as well, aren't you?
Yep. On the kickboxing side, my main fighter is a guy called Kevin Prince Argelia. I've trained him from scratch. He started training the end of 2015. Before that he was a semi-professional footballer in France. He's a very athletic guy.
Yeah.
He came to Malta about 20 years of age. He always wanted to do martial arts, so he started training with me in kickboxing. So 2 years ago, he won a World Kickboxing Association title in K1. That was amateur. He then turned professional. He won the Immortal Champions title in London back in February. So now we're pushing forward. Really, we're just trying to get him through the ranks. So
yeah,
Kevin is my main fighter that I train. I've had another couple of people come to join us since I've been training Kevin, but most of my efforts going to Kevin. The rest of the classes are really just generic classes for sort of just general people, but a lot of my time is spent with Kevin now, and he's got another fight coming up on July the 6th, which is at York Hall, Bethnal Green, on the CFS League. So we're coming over to London for that. And this next year really is quite crucial. We need to get him as far as we can get him, because obviously he's 20. We just turned 30, so we need to get him as many fights, as many good sort of fights as we can. So we're actively looking for sponsorship as well. We look. It looks like we got one, but obviously we're always looking to try and push that side of it. But yeah, I mean that's good. It gives me a lot of it's a lot of hard work, but it's very rewarding when he does well. You know, and it's good. He's a great guy as well. He's got a good attitude. You know, he's just a decent guy. You know,
huge difference, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a good guy. I mean, one of the things, you know, going back again, what I tried to do when I was down in Lewisham in the 90s, when I was a community officer for a year, it's in the book, is about, you know, we spoke about the knife crime. I got into the schools and I actually taught kickboxing there. So what I did was I got into the primary schools about the last year before they get to secondary school. And I used to train the 10 and 11-year-olds. And for 1 year, I taught these primary school kids, and it was a you know tough school down in Deptford. And you know the headmistress, well, she used to say to me, you know, you're the only person they listen to. Basically, that class you do with the boxing, you know, the kickboxing, it's the only class they listen to. And I just think, you know, it's so valuable. I mean, there's a lot of initiatives out there now. You see them all the time. There's people on YouTube like knives down, gloves up, I think it is. There's all sorts of initiatives out there, but yeah, it's not the answer to everything. But if you get some of these kids and you give them something to get interested in, and you give them something to aim for, and you nurture them and you look after them and you give them some sort of guidance, it definitely helps. I mean, I certainly know for a fact that at the end of that year, those kids in that school certainly viewed the police in a much more favourable way than they did before. Now, none of this is happening anymore. You know, there is very little community policing because they haven't got the, you know, even if the people want, even if the guys want to do it, they're not in a position to do it because the resources aren't there. They can't actually get into the schools and do that. And now you've also got a lot of hostility from schools and some education authorities against the police. They don't want them in the schools because they perceive them as, you know, being a bad thing. But I mean, that's a shame. I mean, you know, again, one of the chapters in the book there, the ghetto boys, I talk about.
Yep.
Again, I've had to change all the names, but anyone who knows that area at that time will know exactly who I'm talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
there's one chapter I talk about where I'm walking down Deptford High Street in the market, and these two kids walking towards me, and well, one of them was 15, one of them was, I think he was 16, 17. Anyway, I'm in full uniform, you know, helmet and all the rest of it. And he's come up to me, this little runt, and he's just shoulder barged me in the middle of the market, you know, and he sort of knocked me off balance. I've grabbed him. And of course, that was it. I've got to do something, haven't I? He's just shoulder barged me. I'm in full uniform. I can't let it go. So he's been nicked. And of course, big crowd gathers round. And he gets lifted and we go back to the nick. And it's all a bit puzzling. Oh, why would he do that, you know? And he first of all, he denied that he did it, and he accused me of assaulting him. And then of course his mum came down because you have to have an appropriate person to do the interview, you know, to be with him in the interview, and she was pointing the fingers at me, and it all went wrong. And it wasn't looking that good for me really because it was his word against mine. So the inspector at the time, he said, well, you know, you know, what you know, you've got a bit of a problem here. So anyway, luckily there was a couple of the market traders who saw what had happened and they sort of spoke up for me. So that sort of diffused it. And in the end, he sort of copped a caution. He admitted to it. But anyway, the point was it was a bit of an odd thing to happen. And it transpired that the guy who was with him turned out to be a local player in the Ghetto Boys. And well, in the book, I called him Joseph. I say he's of West African descent. And in the book, I call him Sparky. Well, if you Google Ghetto Boys and put Sparky in, a similar word will come up and you'll find out who that is. But essentially, I sort of recognised him at the time, but I couldn't quite figure out where I saw him. But then I remember it was at one of the boxing clubs. Anyway, this kid, he turned out rather to be he ended up being the leader of the Ghetto Boys down there, and he got accused of a murder that he later got off with. He then fled to America, had some amateur boxing fights, did quite well. He got extradited because he got recognised, came back, got off with a murder, rose up the ranks again of the urban street gangs, and became, you know, say the leader of the Ghetto Boys. He eventually got shot by his best friend. So they all come to a sticky end. But the point is, I mean, but the point I try to get to in the book, he actually wasn't a bad boxer. He was, you know, in many ways he was a bit horrible, but he was actually quite a good boxer. You sort of think, well, okay, if he'd perhaps been grabbed at an earlier age and directed into the boxing at an earlier age, I mean, it could have gone different. I mean, look at people like Tyson and a lot of the other boxers. You know, look, let's be honest. If Gus D'Amato hadn't got hold of Mike Tyson, it would have been a very different story. It's the same thing, and I other people would say, "Oh no, he was just a nasty piece of work, and that's it." Well, I suppose he was, but I still feel if you can intervene at an early enough stage, you could actually, you know, help. And albeit it's not always going to work, and there are so many other factors you have to take into consideration. But that was my little angle, if you like. That was my little bit. And you know, the idea was just to stop these kids joining these urban street gangs. Of course, in the 90s, it was, you know, postcode gangs, and then now it's county lines, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's all the same stuff. At the end of the day, it's taking kids at a very early age to get them started to work for the gangs. You know, ferrying the drugs about. I mean, one of the reasons they use little kids is because they know that they're not undercover old Bill, because the old Bill aren't going to use little kids as decoys, you know.
No,
That's why one of the reasons, seriously, it's one of the reasons they grab them at an early age and they mold them, you know. So all that sort of stuff is relevant. I mean, again, same thing in the other tale I tell about, you know, they call it the triads. It was the two Vietnamese guys.
Yep.
Again, similar sort of thing. These two guys were running around Deptford and being sort of cheeky chappies. They weren't doing anything really serious. They were just nicking cars or driving in cars without their documents, and they looked very similar. Again, I was told not just to identify them totally, so I just called them V1 and V2. But essentially, I took an interest in it because I was into all things martial arts. I was, as well as the boxing and the kickboxing, I was doing the karate, and I got to know these two guys, and I could tell them apart. So quite often, the local units would stop them; they wouldn't be able to recognise them, so I'll get called up to identify them. Anyway, they were Vietnamese, and they lived in one of the streets behind the police station. So one day, I thought, well, let's have a look at this Vietnamese community because they were almost invisible because they kept themselves to themselves, but every now and then there'd be like sort of massive fights on an estate, and by the time the police turned up, it was all sort of over. So I found out that they were training in a church hall just off of one of the main roads there, doing their sort of martial arts stuff. So I've turned up there with a friend of mine, gone in there, and it looked like they were doing taekwondo. It turned out to be some Vietnamese, Vo Việt Nam, I think they called it, Vietnamese martial art. But again, didn't really speak a word of English. We introduced ourselves. They were a bit shocked because we turned up in uniform. I said, "No problem. We're from Lewisham. We're from Deptford. Just introduce ourselves. If you have any issues, you want to talk about anything, let us know."
Yeah.
And they sort of appreciated it. But what did really become apparent was the real language barrier. They couldn't speak. Obviously, we couldn't speak Vietnamese, and they just couldn't speak English. So there's all these barriers that through combat sports and martial arts you can sometimes break down. That was my angle.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, one of those guys, he did come to a sticky end, unfortunately, but
Just a
because
bit.
he was working for he ended up working for the triads, and it went a bit wrong for him. But again, that really was my angle. I mean, the whole theme is the fusion between, if you like, community policing, combat sports, and martial arts, and also in relation to the policing side of it, the reality-based safety training, because yeah, it's important that police officers are trained in reality-based safety training. Now, a lot of people will start talking about combat sports, martial arts, oh, but this doesn't work and that doesn't work, and you can't use that in a real fight, and that's rubbish, and all the rest of it. Okay, I don't really want to get into any of that, but the fact is, any training is better than no training. Yeah.
Yes.
Any training is better than no training, even if you're doing people use the term the traditional martial arts. I prefer to use the term classical martial arts, really, rather than traditional, because if you're talking about, say, for example, pure Shotokan karate, which I still do, I do it because I like doing it. Or if you talk about, Thai boxing, well, okay, Thai boxing has got traditions. They're all traditional. Shotokan karate's got its traditions, but
Hmm.
there's an argument to say, okay, so Shotokan karate or Wado-ryu karate is like classical martial art. If you're doing kata, you're doing form. Bare knuckle fighting, if you like, bare knuckle boxing isn't. But I mean, again, yeah, there's that combat to it, combat side to it. So ultimately, whether you're doing ballet dancing or disco dancing, it's still dancing, isn't it? Now,
Yeah.
you do it in different places and for different reasons. But I just think any form of training, whether you're doing a combat sport or a martial art, is going to improve you, ultimately, physically and spiritually. And I found that just training, as well as any benefits I might get from trying to identify practical techniques for real life, just doing even karate, for example, I find at the end of a karate session, if I've got my instructor there, because I still have an instructor, I don't teach karate, I just do it. I teach the boxing and the kickboxing.
Yeah.
It's nice every now and then to have somebody take away the responsibility of the teaching so that you can switch off and
Yes.
actually just switch off. So you haven't got to assume control of this, session. You know what I mean? So I find that works for me, but it's all done for different reasons. It's not all about, well, what works in real life, what doesn't work in real life. Well, yeah, all right. Some things do, some things don't. And really, the only way to get good at dealing with real scenarios, if you like, or real incidents, is to deal with them a lot. And of course, that then brings its issues insofar as you're exposing yourself to danger. So again, we get back to what we were talking about earlier about the simulation training, trying to simulate incidents and bringing in a bit of stress. There's things you can do. There's lots of people out there doing this sort of stuff. But ultimately, I think my message is that any training is better than no training.
As long as as long as it makes it as realistic as possible. You've got to get used to getting hit, and so
Yeah,
you're prepared for it. If you're
yeah,
not mentally, first time you take a smack in the face is on the job,
Yeah.
you're
No.
not going to be able to respond effectively, are you? Or as effectively.
And even and it's not even, it doesn't even have to be as extreme as that. Just, I mean, I've seen some of these people, they've never been pushed or shoved before. You give them
Yeah.
a push, you know, just a
Yeah.
push or a shove. You know, some of these youngsters have never had anything happen to them. You know, you think, well, and if you try and train them, I've had a parent say, oh, you know, don't be careful, don't do that. I said, what do you think is going to happen in real life? You know, we're not going to hurt anybody, but you've got to actually induce a bit of stress. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
otherwise, what's the point? You know, but yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, but just trying to simulate stress to get it to a point where it's not dangerous, but it actually creates that scenario where they, you know, the stress is up there, and they get some of these effects of, like, you know, tunnel vision or auditory exclusion, just trying to disorientate them to the point where they can feel that. Otherwise, they're not going to know what it's like when it happens. That's the thing. They might still not deal with it when it happens, but at least you're giving them some preparation, you know.
Yeah. It's how to learn to make calm, sensible decisions when your survival system kicks in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because very often it goes sensible things to go out the decisions go out the window, don't they?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's all about actually looking also, and the idea of a good trainer is to be able to identify what you can actually do with certain individuals, because not everybody's the same, are they? That's the thing. You know,
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
some people can cope better than others, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, any training, providing it's safe, is better than no training, you know. And
Definitely.
unfortunately, I do wonder at the moment, if you're just talking about generic policing, unless people decide to do their own thing, which a lot of people do, they'll do
Mhm.
training in their own time, as I did, you know, as well for all those years. I did my own training. If they're not doing that, you do wonder, well, okay, minimum officer safety training, you know, where you're just doing maybe once every 6 months, you know, if you're
Yeah.
lucky, you know, I don't know. I mean,
At this point, I'm going to remind people of your book
yeah,
and to grab a copy because it's an interesting read. Um, I I found that I didn't want to put it down. To be fair, I just wanted to read the next chapter when I got to it. So please do have a look at this. Get yourselves a copy because I think you'll enjoy it. It's a fun read. It's a bit dark in places, so it does take you kind of through the emotional roller coaster a little bit. Um, so, but yeah, I think that's what kept me reading it. So please do get yourselves a copy from Amazon, I believe.
yeah, Amazon. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
available at Amazon. My friend Elroy published it. That's got an interesting story about Elroy. Elroy's spoon-faced pal, because he used to go by the name of Black Legend, and in the year 2000, he had a #1 record with a Barry White cover, and that was his claim to fame. And obviously, he did quite well at that. These days, he works as obviously he's a publisher, but he's also a voiceover artist, and he teaches or he trains other voiceover artists. And how we met, or how I met him, was back in 2016. By that time, we were doing the firearms courses and the shooting weekends, and we had a spate of people come over. We had a spate of actors. Well, it started off with a director. A director came over, and then he brought a few actors over, and they just wanted to go through NSPs and sort of weapon safety so that they looked sort of competent on screen. So we did a bit of stuff with them, and Elroy, actually, out of all of them, he was one of the best. But it was quite interesting because he started talking, and I was talking to him, and I said, well, "Where are you from then?" And it transpires he's from Tottenham. I said, "Oh, really? Okay, Tottenham." And I sort of told him the story about how when I was a kid, I was posted to Tottenham Nick. And
Yeah.
he started coming out. He said, "Oh, yeah." He says, "My dad told me about you lot. You used to beat him up and all his mates and all the rest of it." I said, "Well, hold on a minute." I said, "I don't know about your dad, but let me tell you the other side of the story." And so I told him about some of my experiences, and he was actually, in fairness to him, he's a really cool guy, and he was really enthralled by it. He said, "Oh, you got to write this stuff down, man." He said, "You got to write it down." I said, "Ah, I'm going to write it down." I said, "I'm telling you." I said, "You know." He said, "No, no, you should write it down." And every time, and I obviously he did the firearms training, and he really enjoyed it. And he went off. He did it. He's done a load of movies. You can Google him, Elroy Spoon-Faced Pal. Big, huge guy. He looks a bit like Barry White, and he's at the jiu-jitsu. He's a jiu-jitsu guy, and
Okay.
jiu-jitsu. And he went off, and I kept in touch with him, and he kept going on. Oh, you should write this stuff down. You should write this stuff down. Oh, yeah, okay, all right, whatever. And then the next thing that triggered it in relation to me writing the thing was in 2020, I got a message out of the blue on WhatsApp, and it was from a girl who was in my course in the cadet corps in 1980, B course 1980, and she was trying to start up a reunion. It'd be 40 years reunion from joining the police cadets, so 1980 to 2020. And I thought, oh, okay, sort of thing. So she basically got everyone together, and it didn't happen because of COVID. And then it happened a couple of years later. So we all met in London, and some of these people I hadn't seen since I was 17. Literally, I've seen some of them over the years because a
Yeah.
couple of them I've worked with over the years. But most of these people I hadn't seen since I was 17. So to go from 17 to like, what was it, 58 or whatever I was at the time, and actually seeing these people was wild, really. And then that did not so much on the day, but after that, I started getting all these memories and recollections about the cadet corps, hence the chapter in their core reflections. A lot of that stuff came back. They're already going on at me. And then this thing, this business with the reunion happened. Then I did actually start writing stuff down. And I didn't write it down in any particular order, because as you can see in the book, it sort of flits from one time zone to another. It's not a consecutive thing. It goes from the 90s to the 80s, back to the 90s. It flips backwards and forward, because that's how the human brain works, really, isn't it? It's not a sort of, it doesn't work always in a consecutive, logical way, does it? You think about all
No.
these things. So it was a bit of a bomb burst, and I started writing all this stuff down. And then I told Elroy I'd done it, and he was on it. He said, "Well, we're going to publish the book." And I said, "Publish the book." And I felt a bit uncomfortable about it. He said, "No, you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to do it." So in the end, I did. So as you say, you've got 20 chapters there. It covers the period of time from 1980 to 1997. It also, there's like a social backdrop to it as well. I talk about some of the other incidents that were going on during the time
Yeah.
in the UK to try and put it into perspective. Now, obviously, people who are around in that time will they'll understand this. But people, even if people weren't around at that time, I think some of the youngsters who have read it, they find it really interesting because, oh, really? Did that happen? Little things that we would know about, and they just didn't know about. And it's so yeah, it's had a good response. I mean, at the end of the day, these books. I mean, unless you're Prince Harry or someone, you're not going to sell millions, are you? But I mean, it's had a good sort of response. I've had some good reviews. So yeah, I'm quite happy with it, really. So as I say, in Malta, pushing forward with the Warriors Heart Academy and Pro Force One. And yeah, life's pretty sweet, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to hear that it is.
um,
So it bloody should be.
yeah, exactly. So what, the Ecuador thing then? You want to have a chat about that?
Yes. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll get that, because that's because you sent me links to the videos as they were being kind of edited and processed. So how did that
Well,
did
yeah,
that spur of the moment thing,
quite
or
an interesting thing. I was a bit of an accidental tourist in one respect, because what happened there was I've been obviously I'm always looking for sparring partners for Kevin. We're looking for fighters. Now most of the time we go to the UK because I've got obviously a lot of contacts in London and the UK, and people come over here and we go over there. But I was wanted to go to Latin America anyway. And one of the things I thought was, well, they have good fighters in Latin America. They've got a lot of tough guys, And I wanted to actually go and go. I sent a few emails out. I wanted to go and see some of the gyms, some of the fight gyms. And as it turned out, it didn't actually really materialise because it sort of kicked off when it's over there. But yeah, that was the initial idea, apart from a bit of tourism as well, to have a look at the place. So went to Peru, briefly Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. So this is going back about 4 months now. So basically what happened in Ecuador, when I was just after I got there, one of the main drug lords, a guy called Fito, escaped from prison. And it was obviously big news over there. And it transpired that he was probably assisted by corrupt prison officials or whatever, it's a typical Latin American thing. And a couple of days later, the cartels invaded one of the TV stations, and there was they let off a few rounds, set off a few explosions in the street, and it kicked off. Now, the reason this sort of kicked off I'll simplify this because obviously there's quite a lot to it, but
Yeah.
essentially, a new government came in last November, and the president's a guy called Daniel Noboa, and he's the son of the richest man in Ecuador, and his business is the banana business. Funny enough, it's one of the big business in Ecuador, and he's 36 years old. Now, he came in last November with a strict law and order mandate. So the idea is to clamp down on the cartels. So
Yeah.
since he came to power in November, the cartels have obviously reacted and kicked back, and there have been there's been a spree of attacks and assassinations and assassination attempts. And really, I documented a lot of this stuff even as it was happening or just after it happened. So there's about 9 videos that talks about the history of the narcos in Ecuador and how it got from where it was to where it is today. Just to go back in time, one of the previous presidents was a guy called Correa. Now, he was a socialist, and what he did was back in the in about I think mid 2000s. I'll have to double check, but basically there used to be an American base there, an Air Force base in Ecuador, and
Yeah.
they obviously contained a lot of the exports, the drug exports. They policed the area. Correa kicked out the Americans. So after he kicked out the Americans because he didn't want them there, obviously the cartels stronghold, they regained a stronghold. Now, Ecuador itself isn't a mass producer of narcotics, but it's a very active transshipment zone. So what actually happens is Colombia and Peru produce or manufacture, grow the stuff, and it is shipped out via Ecuador. Ecuador was one of the main routes for exportation. So Correa, the previous president, just so we say, I mean, there's differing views on him, but he wasn't too active in preventing the exportation of the drugs, shall we say.
Yeah.
Accusations have been made against him. So that went on for quite some years. And of course, the cartels were very pleased about that. This Daniel Noboa's come in, he's stamping down on it. And of course, they're kicking off and reacting, and they're assassinating people and getting up to all sorts of mischief. So again, within the last few months, this Daniel Noboa has had a meeting. He had a meeting with an American general, Laura Richardson. They didn't bring the air base back, but what they've started again is land and sea patrols. So obviously they're going to be policing the area with a view to stopping the exploitation. And there's been several cases where they've intercepted submersibles and this sort of thing, where they've done some high end raids where they've recovered tons of gear, literally tons and tons of gear.
Yeah, I've seen some of the videos on social media of
Yeah, and this is really it's ongoing. I mean, you've got the capital is Quito. The main city where Fito is from is Guayaquil. So the last time I looked, he was still on the run. I'm not sure if they've lifted him yet. I haven't looked within the last couple of weeks, but he was actually from Guayaquil. So the 2 previous lords were assassinated. One was allegedly beheaded in prison, but there's a bit of a mystery around that because the body wasn't recovered, and there's a school of thought that this guy was actually not murdered, but they faked the murder, and he's now pulling the strings from behind the scene. But it's all in the videos. They say there's nine videos there that gives the history of narcos in Ecuador, because there's been a lot of stuff, obviously, on Netflix and all the rest of it about narcos. You've had all the big series is about Mexico narcos and the Colombian narcos, but there hasn't been that much on the actual activity in Ecuador, because there's some of the big cartels are actually playing there. The Sinaloa cartel, the Mexican cartel, have got links to the Ecuadorians. Obviously, the Ecuadorians are linked to the big cartels because of the movement of the gear.
yeah.
But there's a lot going on, basically. So, as I say, there's a series of videos there that gives an insight, it gives information about some of these sort of facts, and it names the big players and who's been assassinated and who's still on the run and that sort of thing. So while I was there, I just took an interest in it, really. So I'm not
Well,
quite sure going to go. Maybe Elroy will do something with it. But obviously, it's quite fashionable at the moment. People are interested in the narcos, aren't they? As I say, not
Yes.
much has been done really on the narcos in Ecuador. So I just took it upon myself to do a bit of digging. And I found out a few interesting facts from some of the locals, some of the guides, some of the local cops. They're quite friendly. The people of Ecuador, I have to say, again, very, very friendly people. They don't want any part of it. They just want to live their life. It's like all these places, they get the reputation because of this sort of narco activity, but the normal
Yeah.
people on the street, they're as nice as pie.
Always
So,
the way.
yeah.
The general population are typically, people are nice, aren't they? Just as you say, just want to get on with life. Excuse the
Very
dog.
much so. I mean, one of the videos I compare Latin America to, the UK insofar as, okay, if you look at the reasons why this stuff happens. Okay, if you look at parts of England, you've got extreme wealth, you've got extreme poverty. You
Yeah.
go to Latin America, you've got extreme poverty. You could argue that obviously it's more extreme in Latin America. I suppose it
Yeah.
is. But having said that, the ingredients are still there. Who are the people that join the urban street gangs? The people that join the urban street gangs are the disaffected, the people who haven't got any hope. You
Yeah.
know, they don't all start out bad, do they? They want to actually do stuff and they can't, and their aspirations get crushed, and then they get involved in a petty crime, and then one thing leads to another. Before you know it, they're in the Ghetto Boys or they're in the Los Llaneros cartel or whatever.
Yeah.
That's how it starts. So really the whole theme of what I've been talking about, getting back to everything, the book and everything, is that with using combat sports as a means of intervention, whether it's boxing or kickboxing or whatever it is, karate. I mean, it doesn't have to be combat sport, any sport really, isn't it? As long as they're doing something
That's,
that's
yeah. Anything that because it's a lack of identity, a lack of belonging and purpose. Um, you give people opportunities to have that one way or another. If they don't get it in a positive way, they'll find another way, and it's usually typically quite a negative route, isn't it?
yeah. I mean,
And make money out of it. So they make everybody we need money is described to me by somebody once as being, it's like oxygen. We need it in the
yeah.
world today.
Well, you can't do nothing without it. That's the problem.
No. Yeah. So it's a
Yeah.
bit tricky. So yeah, I think, more needs to be invested into giving people positive ways to engage and feel that sense of belonging and opportunities to make a living. We all have to survive somehow.
I mean, that's the thing. Traditionally, if you go, with straight boxing, just normal boxing, go back into the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
Some of the great fighters come from these deprived backgrounds. Now, obviously, they're the minority, but even if you get a few people, you save a few people, it's something. I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but I mean, it's
No, it's
a positive step. It needs to be a positive step amongst a lot of other positive steps, doesn't it? That's the thing.
yes. Yeah,
You
it's
know,
a cumulative effect.
you know.
Yeah. So there was a clip you wanted that we're going to include in here that you wanted to kind of as a bit of a teaser for the rest of them. So why don't you just talk about it, just tee it up so people can know what to expect.
Yeah, I mean, it basically it talks about the history of the narcos in Ecuador. Without seeing all the others, it gives a brief sort of chronological order of events. So it's only
Okay.
about 3 minutes, isn't it? And it talks about Fito, the guy who escaped, and
Yeah.
the impact on what's happening in Ecuador, and a bit about Daniel Noboa, who's the president, and goes through some of the things I spoke about, but it gives it a sort of chronological order. So you can have a look at that, and then, as I say, there's a few others. They're only on TikTok at the moment. They're nowhere else. As I say, if you like, they're all teasers in a way, because I put them together, gave them to Elroy, and he's going to see if he can actually take a lot of them and harness them in any particular direction. But I mean, if
Yeah.
anyone's interested in the narcos in Latin America, I don't. Some of this stuff has been on the news. I mean, I remember I looked at Al Jazeera, I saw some of it, but a lot of the
It's in
stuff
the
in the
news
videos
here.
I've done, I haven't seen it elsewhere. So if you're interested in it, yeah, just, by all means, have a look. As I
Well, what
say,
we'll do is we'll let people watch this one now, and then
yeah,
we'll put in your links for people to check out your book, um, Warrior Heart Academy in Malta, and the firearms training and etc. and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, fantastic.
That well, and obviously we'll put your link to your TikTok so people can check out the other videos and stuff that you've done.
Great, yeah. Hope they enjoy them. As I say, there's not that much out there about Ecuador. If you really look for it, you'll find it, but it's not really as in your face, I suppose, as the Colombian stuff and the Mexican stuff. So
No, it was. I mean, it was on the TV. It was on the news here, mainly when they took over the station.
yeah, that
And
was good news, yeah, yeah.
that was the big thing. But there's nothing now. There's not. That was about it, and it was very short lived. Obviously not newsworthy enough when all the big lot of guns and shooting and
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in that video, it talks about dollarization. So many years ago, the currency was the sucre. It was the local currency.
Mhm.
And that was named after one of the generals who liberated. I'll talk about that in that video as well. One of the
Yeah.
generals who liberated, well, not just Ecuador, South Latin America from the Spanish, and that 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 really sort of is deemed to be one of the reasons the cartels have flourished, because dollarization obviously makes it very easy to launder money and to make transactions because you don't have to convert money. So they would argue, or some people would argue, that that's one of the reasons the cartels have flourished, because of dollarization. They lost their own currency. It wouldn't have stopped it, but it just
No.
makes it even easier. So that's one of the things that is discussed in the video. And obviously I went to the town centre in Quito, I think it was, and there was the statues of the generals, Sucre and a couple of the others,
Yeah.
and Bolivar, and you look at it and you think, well, okay, they fought to get rid of the Spanish, to get the independence for these Latin American countries, and what, a couple hundred years later, in fact, 200 years to the year, because it's the 200th anniversary of independence, 2024, it was 1824. You do wonder how they'd feel if, after all their sort of battles, the country's just been taken over by narcos. It's just a bit
Yeah.
bizarre. You know, so that, yeah, it sort of talks about that. But yeah, I mean, I found it interesting anyway. So I think some other people may do. So
Well, yeah, it's something that's not very well known, and giving people a bigger piece of the pie in another part of the world. I think it's yeah, it's interesting stuff. So
yeah,
no, good on you for doing it, and for having the idea to do it in the first place. I was obviously spurred on by being there when it actually happened. So,
but that is the plus side of these phones, isn't it? We
yeah,
were about them earlier. But
yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's
I'm
nothing you
guilty
can't.
now.
Yes.
Got the phone out.
So
We got it
yes,
in my face, but we'll put it in someone else's face. That's
yeah.
it.
Oops.
But yeah, no, it was interesting, and I found the cops quite friendly actually. I mean, I chatted to the cops in Colombia. Obviously, I told them, I identified myself. Told us they were very amenable, and again the cops in Ecuador, again they're the same all over the world. They're just trying to do a job, they're just trying to do a job. I mean, they get a raw deal, they get a bad reception, what's the word? They get a bad reputation. They're all accused of being, bent, and on the payroll of the cartels. Well, all
Yeah.
right, some of them probably are, but not all of them, and there's some good ones, and, and it's just, it's the same old story, isn't it, really, all around the
It
world.
is, unfortunately. It's just,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. It's the same the world over.
Yeah.
It will never go away.
Nah,
Not
sure.
as long as there's humans on the planet.
However long that's going to be now.
Well, yeah, yes, opinions vary.
That's right. Yeah. I'm all right in Malta. They'll miss.
Yeah, no, it's got quieter there. Yeah,
23 miles by 17. They're gonna...
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, listen, mate, thank you for chatting about your life from 1980, really, I suppose, really, in mainly um an interesting meander through time. And having read your book, really enjoyed it. Genuinely, really enjoyed it.
No, I'm pleased. Yeah, I'm pleased
It
you
was
did.
nice. Um, it was in the nice. It was easy to read.
Yeah.
It
Good.
was because it flowed nicely, or you're dotting around, but it was a good read. I enjoyed it, and yeah, well, I hope more people take up on getting a copy and having a read, because it is a hell of an insight into community policing in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, there's some funny stuff and there's some dark stuff, but it's got a bit of everything.
Glad you enjoyed it, Simon. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, no, and I'll put out all your links on
Yeah.
here that people can access and find out more about what you're doing,
Cool.
and obviously buy your book.
Yes. And come over to Malta, Simon. You've got to come over here.
Yeah, I will do. Yeah, it's definitely have to get my arse in
Warmer
gear.
than Aberdeen.
Just a tad. Although today it's about 22 degrees, which for here
Oh,
is
perhaps not today
it's
then.
tropical today.
Cool.
It's not as consistent as Malta.
No, 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 no. That's true. All right, mate.
Um, so yeah, listen, mate, thank you so much for
My pleasure. Hope you enjoyed it.
and yeah, we shall speak again soon.
Lovely.
Cheers, bud.
Thanks.